orders of the day.
Government orders, government bills, commons, consideration at report stage of Bill C-58, an act to amend the Canada Labour Code and Canada Industrial Relations Board Regulations, 2012.
There being no motion at report stage, the House will now proceed without debate to the putting of the question on the motion to concur in the bill at report stage. Madame Bibeau pour Monsieur O'Regan, appuyé par
Mr. Guilbeault for Mr. O'Regan, seconded by Mr. Boissonnault, moves that Bill C-58, an act to amend the Canada Labour Code and the Canada Industrial Relations Board Regulations 2012, as amended, be concurred in at report stage.
Member participating person wishes the motion to be carried or carried on division, or if a member of a recognized party participating in person wishes to request a recorded division, and invite them to rise and indicate it to the chair. Carried on division. Carried on division. I therefore declare the motion carried. And when shall this bill be read a third time? Now. Madame Bibeau pour Monsieur O'Regan, appuyé.
Ms. Guilbeault for Mr. Regan, seconded by Mr. Boissonnault, moved that Bill C-58, an act to amend the Canada Labour Code and the Canada Industrial Relations Board Regulations 2012, be now read a third time and do pass.
Débat.
Debate.
L'honorable secrétaire.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And what a pleasure it is to be able to rise and speak to legislation that is so important to Canada's economy, and it contributes in many different ways. I like to think that at times we get legislation that comes before us that can receive wide support. And it's an issue in which, for me, on a personal note, Mr. Speaker, I could ultimately go back to when I was first elected back in 1988 as probably one of the most substantive issues back then that I had to face inside the Manitoba legislature. And it was done in a different form. Labor has always been an important aspect of my political career, as I know it has been for many of my colleagues. Very proud of the fact that we have what I would suggest to you is a very progressive Prime Minister that understands how important labor is to our country. We have a very proactive Minister of Labor who has been given a mandate to bring in anti-scab legislation. This is the type of legislation that I have talked about for many years, Mr. Speaker. It's the type of legislation that you will find that the Minister of Labor has been talking about for a long time also. It's the type of legislation that when we were in opposition, we often heard private members' bills coming from the Conservative Party in which we were in opposition to because they were anti-union organizing pieces of legislation, Mr. Speaker. So at the end of the day, it would appear, based on second reading and what I've been hearing from other members of the chamber, there is a very good chance that this legislation will pass unanimously, Mr. Speaker. And I really and truly hope that it does, because I think it says a very powerful message to all Canadians in terms of the important role that unions play in today's society, the importance of having labor harmony in Canada, and how this legislation can have a positive impact, Mr. Speaker. I would encourage members to take a look at, for example, anti-replacement workers or anti-scab legislation that was really first brought in the province of Quebec. And then the following province that brought it in would have been British Columbia. And you will find that I would ultimately argue, and many others inside this chamber no doubt would add their voice to it, that through that legislation, what we saw was more harmony in the workforce. Ultimately, Mr. Speaker, I believe that the type of legislation that's being proposed in expectation that it will receive widespread support is something that's really encouraging. And it's something that we should not be taking for granted. Because as a political issue, as I say, it's been with me for many years. And if I can just reflect on that for a bit, Mr. Speaker, just to give people a sense in terms of just how controversial it could be. In my home province of Manitoba, and Manitoba is an important part of Canada's labour history. And maybe before I go on to my specific case, just so that people that are following the debate today will realize that labour history in Canada is actually, I would suggest to you, one of the most major protests that we saw at the very beginning would have been with George Brown, who was the founder of the Globe and Mail, as someone that organized or played an important role in terms of a printing press people, Mr. Speaker, where there was a significant rally in front of the Toronto legislature. But fast forward it to the one I often talk about, and that is the Winnipeg General 1919 strike, which is embedded in the minds of many, Mr. Speaker, even non-union members. I often will look at the Free Press, where one of the pages and pictures that they continuously reprint is the trolley car that was turned over during the 1919 strike, the Bloody Saturday, and the impact that has had on the labour movement here in Canada. In fact, on the 100th anniversary of the 1919 general strike, we contributed as a House of Commons to the trolley, a replica, and it being put in just outside of Pantages or just across the street from City Hall, so that people that are walking by get a sense in terms of what had taken place, because it stands out there and you have to wonder, why is that there? And it's connected to something that the Free Press publishes, as I say, on a regular basis, that trolley car. It's very symbolic for the city of Winnipeg, and I would suggest to you, even our country. Because through that strike that had taken place, and through organized labor at the time, the area in which I represent, the Ukrainian Labor Temple, Mr. Speaker, which is in the north end of Winnipeg, the traditional north end of Winnipeg, on McCrager, Mr. Speaker, you will see that the organizers would often be in different areas, in particular in the north end of Winnipeg, organizing that strike. And what we found is that even though there was some low points where workers were hurt, maimed, and killed, at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, what I took away from that particular strike was that labor was not just concerned about the working conditions that people found themselves in. From my perspective, it took on a social movement of sorts, where it wasn't just about working X number of hours and how much money that we're getting paid. It was about the way of life and how people, in particular people with smaller incomes Mr. Speaker, were being exploited, taken advantage of. And that there was a role for unions at the time, not only to advocate for those wages and working conditions, but often reflected on social programming. So when I take a look at Winnipeg, I think it's a good example in terms of what had taken place and the labor movement ever since, Mr. Speaker. And in 1988, when I was first elected, we had this thing called final offer selection. And at the time, it was being debated. You had the Conservative Party, Progressive Conservative Party, that opposed the legislation and you had the NDP who supported the legislation but were not prepared to accept any sort of amendments to the legislation. At the time, we were the official opposition in the Liberal Party, and for us, we wanted to maintain the legislation, and we were prepared to accept an amendment if, in fact, the Conservatives would allow the legislation to survive. Well, we sat for many hours, late into the evening, on committees, heard from many different unions on a wide spectrum of issues. And it was something that was actually fought for to get the final offer selection. It was a compromise. Final offer selection was brought in by Howard Pawley, NDP Premier, as a compromise. You see, because in the election prior, Howard Pawley had actually promised to bring in anti-scab legislation. So Manitoba was going to have anti-scab legislation, but because of the resistance, the NDP at the time decided not to bring in replacement worker legislation, but as a compromise brought in the final offer selection. And in the first 2 years as a parliamentarian, in a minority situation, I can tell you that it was an extensive debate that had taken place. So it's kind of like a crash course on the importance of labor, listening to so many representatives from labor and from management, Mr. Speaker, and other stakeholders that came there. And literally sitting through all sorts of hours and hours of committees to the debates that had taken place. Sadly, final offer selection was killed. And it was, I would ultimately argue, prematurely killed because the political parties collectively could not see the merit in having final offer selection. And for those of you that don't necessarily understand what final offer selection is it provided the union the opportunity to say that, look, negotiations are not going well. There's a level of untrust that we cannot overcome. And then they would request that final offer selection be implemented. And through final offer selection, then you get this arbitrator who would come in and say to the union and to the management group, give me your best offer. And ultimately, that's what would happen. Both sides would present to the arbitrator, and the arbitrator was not allowed to change anything. The arbitrator had to take one over the other with no modifications. And I think that if one was to review the Hansards of back then, you will find that it was actually fairly effective. It made both union and management come to the table and give it their best shot, and knowing full well that one side was not necessarily going to be overly happy because the other side was going to be chosen. And the argument in part back then is that over time it would in fact work out. And it was used, Mr. Speaker. And I believe that it proved to be effective. But sadly, because there was no consensus that was being achieved between the political parties, the personalities at the time, Mr. Speaker, we ended up losing final offer selection in Manitoba. In my opinion, that set back labor relations and many of the efforts of unions. And then I would reflect over the years, and if you even check, Mr. Speaker, even as a member of Parliament, in previous years as an MP, I've raised the issue of final offer selection. Because that was an opportunity that Manitoba lost because there was no political consensus. Fast forward it to today, where we have a Minister of Labor who has vested so much time and energy with the department and has come forward with a piece of legislation that is ultimately being supported, from what I understand, from all members of the House of Commons. So through the ideas of whether it's the Prime Minister in bringing it in as a part of a platform, to issuing it in the form of a mandate letter, to a caucus that truly understands the importance of labor and how it impacts the Canadian economy and society, we had the support to move forward on this substantive issue. And we quickly found out we expected to receive support from the New Democrats and even the Bloc, because of the history of the Bloc in the province of Quebec, Mr. Speaker. But what was pleasantly surprised was that for that, but I'm not going to do that, Mr. Speaker. I am going to take it that they actually do support. They do support the legislation, Mr. Speaker, and I'm going to say that the glass is half full, and it's going to be full because at the end of the day, I really do think it's going to pass with the unanimous support of the House. And I shouldn't take for granted the Green Party. My understanding is that the Green Party, being a progressive party, will hopefully also be endorsing the legislation. I can't recall offhand what it is that the leader of the Green Party has said. I see this, Mr. Speaker, as a positive thing. I think it sends a powerful message, and other provinces should take note of it. I can tell you, my daughter, who's a provincial MLA in the province of Manitoba, shortly after us introducing the legislation, brought it up in Manitoba. And today I can tell you that the province of Manitoba seems to be moving forward on the issue of anti-scab legislation, with a huge expectation that we will see that legislation brought into the province of Manitoba. And I think that's a wonderful thing, because you see, the federal legislation only has limitations in terms of who all it impacts. And the ideal situation is that we have provinces throughout the country recognize that not only does the province of Quebec have it and the province of British Columbia, but now we have leadership coming from Ottawa indicating that Ottawa is moving forward, and more important, Mr. Speaker, or just as important, it appears to be moving forward with the support of all political parties. Because when I've had the types of debates, the partisan types of debates in the past, I haven't seen the type of support that this legislation is actually receiving. So I want to personally congratulate the Minister of Labour in particular and his team of individuals that was able to do the consultation that was necessary, the work that's so very important, Mr. Speaker, in achieving a consensus. And that consensus will, in fact, benefit all of us. As not only am I optimistic for the province of Manitoba, but I believe that there are other provinces that are out there that will take note. And whether it's individual members in other legislatures, or it's political parties as a whole, recognizing that, my gosh, if Ottawa can pass this kind of legislation, that provincial jurisdictions can too. And we have two provinces that have already done so, Mr. Speaker, that have had it in place for years. And that's why I believe that this is legislation, Mr. Speaker, that can really have a positive outcome for us as a nation. Because it is about labor harmony. And when you talk about building a stronger and healthier economy, when you talk about having a sense of fairness, Mr. Speaker, when you talk about enhancing the middle class, when you talk about investing in solid social programs, whether it's pensionable programs, whether it's health care services, whether it's other programs dealing with issues like seniors, people of disabilities. These are issues that the labor movement has been talking about for many, many years and has contributed in a positive way. You know, we have pharmacare that's on our agenda, and I can recall meeting with union reps to talk about the importance of pharmacare. So I believe, Mr. Speaker, that at the end of the day, that we take advantage of the consensus that I believe is out there here on the floor of the House of Commons. We recognize how this type of legislation is going to help Canada's economy and our society as a whole, Mr. Speaker. I believe it will have a positive impact on labor here in Canada. Now, you're telling me I only have about 30 seconds to go. Mr. Speaker, there's lots of details within the legislation. The Minister of Labour has highlighted it. We've had it go through second reading where that was highlighted. I would require another half hour or so to go through that detail, but I don't want to filibuster the legislation, Mr. Speaker, or ask for a unanimous consent to have the leave to do so. So I'll leave my comments on that positive note. It's great to see members of all political parties unite behind good, solid labor legislation, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
So it's great to start off a morning with the Honourable Member for Winnipeg North. Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Edmonton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it is refreshing to hear the member from Winnipeg North speak in this House as opposed to one of the many, many other Liberals who are always up speaking instead. Now, I want a couple comments. First of all, he said himself, such an important issue. I've talked about it so many years. The Minister of Labour has talked about it so many years. It's funny how it's so important it's taken them 9 years. I think it's a tiny bit of political opportunism there. But I want to quote from the Canadian Encyclopedia. He talked a lot, as he did previously on C-58, about the Great Strike in 1919. Canadian Encyclopedia says the cause of the strike was inflation costs, housing and food too much to afford. How does a member feel about creating the identical situations in Canada under his government that caused the Great Strike in 1919?
The Honourable Member, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, in the continuation of my speech and the spirit in terms of which the question is being posed, I'm going to keep positive, Mr. Speaker, because I believe that if you take a look at Canada's interest rate or our inflation rate, what you will find in comparison to virtually any other country in the world, in particular, let's say the G7 countries or the G20 countries, Canada is doing exceptionally well. And in fact, our inflation rate now has dropped to 2.7%, and we are on target for the last 4 months. Hopefully, we're going to be able to see that decrease in interest rate. It's important that as a House of Commons, not only should the government be focused on trying to improve the economic conditions, even though we are doing much better than most of our peers, Mr. Speaker, it's still important that we focus our attention on that than a lot of the other more negative aspects of politics that we often witness on the floor of the House of Commons. And by doing that, Mr. Speaker, I think that we're actually helping Canadians. I think that over the next number of months, and hopefully collectively we can come into an agreement that the inflation rate will remain in the direction that it is going, and hopefully we're going to see more relief in regards to interest rates, but we have to respect the independence of the Bank of Canada.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Manicouagan. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Obviously, I'm happy that my colleague on the other side of the House sees the glass half full. And if I was on his side, I'd probably try to do the same thing. He also talked about the fact that it was really quick for C-58 with the government action to come through. The first bill was tabled by my colleague from Mégoncourt in 1990. We've had 30 bills since. So also C-75 from my colleague was also tabled and at the block. As soon as this bill receives royal assent, we'd like it to be implemented. But we couldn't agree. At committee, other members wanted 18 months before it would come into force. So we'd like it to come into force quickly. And with the upcoming election, it kind of endangers the implementation of this legislation. So does he still agree that the glass is half full? How come we can't have it come into force the first day after it receives royal assent? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I'm thinking in terms of when we first came into government back in 2015 and 2016, if you take a look at some of the substantive measures that we had taken, the first issue was dealing with Canada's middle class and giving them that tax break, and I'm sure the member can recall that, and it was very well received. Other legislations that we did was to take back private members' bills that many had perceived as anti-union bills. That was something that was, again, very well received, in particular by our labor movement. And we have been very much proactive in terms of providing for supports in things such as apprenticeship training, looking at ways in which we can promote and have more harmony within the labor force. And of course, there's always a consultation. Now, you have to factor in that there's also a worldwide pandemic that had to be dealt with. There's all sorts of things. But even having a very busy legislative agenda over the years, the ministers have, in fact, been working with labor in particular, but other stakeholders. And ultimately, I think it's great that we have the legislation at the stage that we have it, and let's acknowledge it. And we've built that consensus. Because that we did it right, we now have the type of consensus we have today, and hopefully we'll see it pass through today.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Edmonton-Griesbach.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And today is a good day for workers. It's a good day for New Democrats, and it's a good day to make certain that unions can participate in making sure they have powerful paychecks, because powerful paychecks come from powerful unions. Mr. Speaker, this is an incredible success and a testament to workers and their exercising of rights across the country. It's immensely disappointing, though, to know that both the Liberals and Conservatives, when New Democrats tabled this bill 15 times, they voted against. Mr. Speaker, it's incredibly important that we acknowledge the hard work of the unions who've been pushing this for generations now. I'm proud to be part of a party that forced this government to bring this legislation to a vote. I'm proud to be part of a party that's going to ensure that unions actually have the power to make sure that their material conditions are improved. Mr. Speaker, why has it taken the Liberals so long to participate in making sure that unions are more powerful?
The Honourable Member for Winnipeg North.
Well, Mr. Speaker, you know, it's really encouraging to recognize that for the first time we have a very much a progressive Prime Minister that understands and appreciates the importance of supporting Canadians and labour. And you know, we haven't been in, this Prime Minister has not been in government for 15 years. I can understand the frustration. You know, because, you know, as I made reference to Howard Pauley's promise of anti-scab legislation many, many years ago, well over 30 years ago. And 30 years ago, we could have had final offer selection. And we've been waiting for the longest time for that. But because we now have the federal legislation, because members of all political parties are likely going to be supporting it, Manitoba, Mr. Speaker, is likely going to be getting anti-scab legislation. In other words, let's not necessarily look at patting, and even though some might say I've been patting on the back too, but let's put the union worker and the workers across Canada, even non-union workers. Let's recognize the many contributions labor has had that goes far beyond just the working environment and wages and so forth. Think in terms of the social programs that have here today and the contributions that the labor movement has had in making those become often a reality, and the endless lobbying they do. And I do thank the New Democrats and others that participated in making today possible.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Nepean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the trade union movement has played a key role over a period of, I think, more than 1.5 centuries in improving the working life of the workers. I think the trade union movement has ensured that as the countries industrialized, as the countries developed, the standard of living of all the people in the society is good because of the agreements that they were able to strike with the employers. This legislation affects the federally regulated industry with over 22,000 employers and about 1 million employees. I'm glad the member talked about his experience in Manitoba when the final offer selection could not go through. And he is right in one way that while it gives benefit to 1 million employees in the federally regulated sector, much more responsibility is with the provinces. I would like to ask him his opinion on or his suggestions on how we can influence provinces to take measures in the same way that now the federal government is moving.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
I think the most important thing is that the federal government has recognized that anti-scab legislation is good legislation, and the reason why we've brought it forward, because it's good for Canada. It's good for our economy. It's good for the workers. What's good for the workers is good for Canada. And so that's the most important thing. The second thing that Ottawa can do is doing what we're doing today. We've now appeared to have a consensus where all political entities in the House are going to be voting in favor of that. To me, that sends a very powerful message to all the different provinces. The reason why I brought up the Manitoba situation is it was because of political partisanship that Manitoba never got anti-scab legislation. It was because of political partisanship that final offer selection was killed. Here today, we are demonstrating that if you put the political partisanship aside, good legislation can pass for the betterment of our country and our workers.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's always an honour to rise on behalf of the residents of Kelowna Lake Country. I rise today to speak on Bill C-58, an act to amend the Canada Labour Code and the Canada Industrial Relations Board regulations. This legislation passed at second reading with support of the Conservatives and was recently scrutinized at the Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skills and Social Development and the Status of Persons with Disabilities, termed the Human Resources Committee, where I'm proud to serve as Vice Chair on behalf of the Conservative Caucus. I'd like to thank all Conservative members, but in particular the Conservative member for Dufferin-Caledon for his work on this legislation and for attending our committee meetings on this. The Human Resources Committee heard from a wide variety of relevant witnesses to this legislation and to the issue of replacement workers at large. The committee heard from many labor representatives and business industry stakeholders. We also heard testimony from the Canada Industrial Relations Board, whose work will be affected by this legislation. From my observations, there seemed to be a lot of interest from all parties to ask questions and to delve into the work they do and how this legislation could potentially affect their workload and operations. For myself, I had a much better understanding of their internal processes once they had answered all of our questions. Many witnesses at committee spoke of the importance of the board. It is the federal government that has the responsibility for this National Canadian Industrial Relations Board. And while the legislation before us intends to encourage faster decision-making at the board, ultimately it is on the Liberal government to ensure it is properly operating to resolve labor conflicts that come before it and to meet the needs of those involved. Representatives of both employers and labor said that the Canada Industrial Relations Board needs to be operating faster now and moving forward. And in fact, an amendment at committee, which is now in this legislation, reduced the number of days the Canadian Industrial Relations Board is required to render decisions. One other point I'll note in this legislation is there was an amendment at committee, supported by all members, to move up the coming into force date for this legislation. I'd like to bring to the House some of the important feedback we heard from various stakeholder witnesses on C-58. Several points were raised during the committee study of this legislation. While the Liberals may trumpet this legislation as focusing on replacement workers, they themselves have been replacing workers in government workplaces with Liberal-friendly external contractors. Mr. Speaker, it is a fact that this government has spent more on expensive external outsourced contractors than ever before. We know this affects workers in many ways. For example, the president of the Customs and Immigrations Union appeared before the Standing Committee on Public Accounts. He said that when it came to the role of the disastrous $60 million ArriveCan app, quote, "We believe the goal of the app is to replace officers," unquote. He spoke on how he believes that had his workers been listened to during the ArriveCan process, instead of being replaced by a two-person IT firm at the cost of $60 million to taxpayers, then, quote, "a great deal of what happened would not have happened," unquote. At the Human Resources Committee study of C-58, we heard from Labour representatives how outsourced contractors and consultants were a concern for their workers. Mr. Speaker, this Liberal government says it stands on the side of Labour, yet actively sidelines its hard-working public service workers and, worse yet, replaces their work with expensive, outsourced consultants and contractors at the cost of billions to taxpayers. We also heard from Labour representatives that outside consultants and contractors can be demoralizing for their workers when someone has been hired from outside as an external contractor to oversee these duties or do the same duties. So again, the Liberals say they have hired, the Liberals have hired a lot of public sector workers during their time in government. These workers surely have needed experience and expertise, but then behind closed doors, the Liberals choose to not trust them with major government initiatives and instead replace their work with high-priced, Liberal-friendly contractors and consultants at the cost of billions of dollars to Canadian taxpayers. One of the things Bill C-58 does is to amend the maintenance of activities process to, quote, encourage employers and trade unions to reach an earlier agreement respecting activities to be maintained in the event of a legal strike or lockout, unquote. Our committee heard from many stakeholders on the types of implementations that typically arise when identifying these essential activities. One of the challenges identified was what qualifies as work that is in the national interest, public safety, or critical infrastructure. While these may be easy to identify as essential activities in some workplaces, we heard of some challenges of identifying essential activities in often limited windows of time. Lastly, while I spoke earlier about the concerning trend of this Liberal government endorsing replacement work through outside contractors and consultants inside the government, I'd also like to speak to the government's record of replacing Canadian workers with international workers as part of multi-billion-dollar agreements with major corporations. When this Liberal government signed agreements that provided $44 billion in taxpayer money to massively profitable corporations in exchange for building electric battery plants in Ontario, they promised it would create Canadian jobs. When Conservatives pointed out that these plants would be built with international labour instead of Canadian labour, both the Liberal Employment Minister and Liberal Industry Minister tried to downplay the number, saying it would only be a small handful. Well, Conservatives didn't believe them, and neither did Canada's building trades unions. They wrote a letter to the Prime Minister outlining how foreign workers are displacing Canadian labourers at the Nexstar construction site, all the while 180 local millwrights and ironworkers were unemployed and available to perform the necessary work. To quote the Canadian Building Trades Union president in his letter to the Prime Minister, quote, "Canadian workers are now being replaced by international workers at an increasing pace on work that was previously assigned to Canadian workers. Unquote. Replaced. The Liberal ministers also weren't truthful when they said this was only a short-term issue that required foreign replacement workers who had, quote, specialized knowledge, unquote. As the letter from Canadian Building Trades Union points out, quote, this is the brazen displacement of Canadian workers in favor of international workers by major international corporations thumbing their noses at both the Government of Canada, taxpayers, and our skilled trades workers, unquote. Now, the Liberals say they want to ban replacement workers, yet they've allowed Canadian workers to be replaced in favor of the demands of internationally profitable organizations. During the Labour Minister's appearance at committee on C-58, we asked him why he hadn't demanded a memorandum as part of the deal to guarantee hiring Canadian contractors for the Stellantis plant. The minister said he did not view this as his role and that it was a matter of provincial jurisdiction, even though potential foreign workers coming to Canada is a federal responsibility. Workers can't trust these words or the promises of more jobs supposedly outlined in these agreements with Stellantis or other deals. If the Liberals wanted to regain their trust, they should simply make the commitment for Canadian jobs outlined in these agreements public, but they refuse to do so. At other committees, Conservative members tried to get access to the contracts. However, Liberal and NDP members filibustered to protect the government and prevent workers, from hearing the truth. Now, in addition, Conservatives were pushing this Liberal government to release details of its agreement with Honda Canada on building their electric vehicle operation in Ontario, to have disclosure which is necessary to ensure Canadians get all the jobs in this multi-billion-dollar project. Now, yes, the NDP, the party that calls itself a friend of workers, are joining with the Liberals in hiding contracts from Canadian workers and the Canadian public. One of the other things I'll bring up just with respect to workers is with respect to the Just Transition legislation, which has been renamed. And we know that an internal government document disclosed that there would be 2.7 million workers who would be affected by the legislation. There is a lot of uncertainty with this. There is a lot of concern by what this means, and it is creating a lot of stress for workers in the country, particularly those in the energy sector. In this lengthy government document, it does outline some other potential jobs. However, they are nowhere near at the same level that you would consider for pay and for benefits. So there is a lot of concern by workers in this country, and legislation like that certainly does not put people's mind at ease. It's one of the great privileges of my role as Shadow Minister of Employment, Workforce Development, and Disability Inclusion to travel this country and speak to many workers. And the input that I've had from them has really been very, very meaningful to hear what a lot of their issues are and what a lot of their suggestions are. And I do appreciate those conversations. So, Mr. Speaker, Conservatives have been supporting this legislation along the way and continue to, though it is clear that this legislation before us today alone will not resolve all of the issues of workers being replaced in many different ways. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire, the Honourable Member for Nepean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his speech. I commend the Conservatives' approach to supporting this bill, protecting the fundamental right of the workers and recognizing the important work the trade unions do in improving the workplace, healthy workplace, and the safety of the employees. I would like to ask her comment on this issue that federally regulated industries that is covered in this bill affects about 22,000 employers and about 1 million employees. However, bulk of the working class population in Canada are working in industries and sectors that are provincially managed. What is her suggestion on how we can influence the provinces to adopt the objectives of this bill so that every Canadian worker will get the same benefit?
The honourable member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. We are here today debating Bill C-58. This is in the final stages in this House, and what I can say is just referencing this specific bill, which is for federally regulated workers. It has gone through all of the processes. We did have a number of amendments. I didn't speak to all of the amendments here today just due to time, but we did have a number of amendments that did come through committee that were approved of and are now in this legislation. And so we look forward to moving forward with this legislation so that it can move into the next stages in the parliamentary process.
Questions and comments? Kitchen Kamal-Tyre, the honourable member for Victoria.
Mr. Speaker, workers at Cascadia Liquor in Victoria and across Vancouver Island are on strike for fair wages. Now, Cascadia Liquor faces a legal complaint for breaking BC law by bringing in replacement workers. New Democrats have been fighting for federal anti-scab legislation for decades, but the truth is, the Conservatives and the Liberals voted against it. Most recently, in 2016, when the NDP brought it forward, but it's been dozens of times. Conservatives pretend that they support workers, but you won't see them on a picket line. New Democrats will keep fighting for workers. I joined Cascadia workers on the picket line last week, and I will continue to stand in solidarity with them because powerful paychecks come from powerful unions.
The honourable member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I think that was a statement as opposed to a question. So all I'll say is that we have Bill C-58 before us here today. As I mentioned, we have been working this legislation through the parliamentary processes. We had very good testimony at committee. We had some recommendations that were approved of through amendments, and here we are today at this stage, and that's what we're debating here today. And as I mentioned, Conservatives are supportive of the amended legislation before us.
Questions and comments? Kitchen Kamal-Tyre, the honourable member for South Shore St. Margaret's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've heard a lot from the illiterate liberal economic policy on the other side with regard to this and other things. And one of the things I find fascinating is that they speak out of one side but do the other in terms of their position. So while they express themselves about this bill, they allow foreign replacement workers at the Stellantis plant in Windsor, but they're so afraid to prove that they protected Canadian jobs, which clearly they haven't since we have these foreign replacement workers, that they won't release the contracts and prove us wrong. I've read the contracts. So I'd like to ask the member what her view is on foreign replacement workers in relation to this bill.
The honourable member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question. Absolutely, this is a concern, and I outlined in some of my intervention here how we did bring this up at committee, and unfortunately the minister was very vague. We know that the information that they had given initially on this was that, it's a very small handful of people, and we found out that that is factually incorrect. It is very concerning, and if the government doesn't have anything to hide, then they should absolutely disclose what the arrangements are.
Question Kamal-Tyre. Questions and comments? The honourable member for South Okanagan West Kootenay.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my neighbour in Kelowna Lake Country for her speech. I just want to point out that so many times I hear Conservatives bring up criticisms of anti-scab legislation, saying it will extend, delay, make these labour disputes longer and longer, when in fact it's the labour disputes when replacement workers are brought in that become dangerous, become vicious, and become very, very long and tear communities apart. I think of the giant mine in Yellowknife where 9 people were killed by people so frustrated that they have been replaced and had no choice. I'm just wondering if she could comment on the fact that anti-scab legislation is actually good for bringing people together, for making, giving workers their right to remove their labor when they feel that they need to put pressure on management to get fair wages and good working conditions. And that's the only power they have.
The honourable member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. What I can speak to is that what is before us today is Bill C-58, and that is the legislation that is before us. We have had healthy debate in this House of Commons over this legislation. We had a lot of testimony at committee, and it went through all of its processes there. We had some amendments that made the legislation even better than it was before. I outlined a couple of them in my intervention. And so here we are today with this legislation, which does affect federally regulated industries. And as I mentioned, we have been supportive of this legislation and working towards making it better. And in particular, with the Labor Board, it was, as I mentioned in my intervention, it was good to hear from them and get a lot of our questions answered as to their internal operations, so that we could better understand how they deal with the different applications that come forth, and what they're going to do moving forward in order to improve their processing times. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? No voix. Oh, the honourable member for Port Moody, Coquitlam.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. And, I have a simple question, Mr. Speaker. I know that the Conservatives were playing many games in committee to try to prolong the vote on this legislation, and I just want to understand more clearly why the Conservatives haven't supported this the years and years and years that the NDP have tried to move it forward. Hear, hear.
The honourable member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the member sits with me at committee. I'm unclear what she's referencing, because we had set committee days on that were set for to hear from witnesses on this. We had clause by clause. There was absolutely no delays. I'm really not sure what she's referencing. We asked witnesses questions. We had clause by clause that went very expeditiously, and I'm really unclear what she's even referencing. I think she's trying to create a story that's not there.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, Government House Leader.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'll stay away from the member's comments that clearly demonstrate the Conservatives' opposition to Stellantis and to Volkswagen and to Honda. I understand they don't support the federal government bringing those companies to Canada. But what confuses me is I'm not sure if the member fully understands a replacement worker anti-scab legislation. That means you have a company that's in existence in Canada, and they go on, there's a strike that takes place, that the company would not be able to bring in replacement workers. That's what we're actually talking about when it comes to replacement workers. And I just want the member to give confirmation that that is, in fact, her understanding also.
Member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the comment from the member for his concern over me being informed. Of course, I have read the legislation. I sit on the committee that dealt with it clause by clause, so very involved in this legislation. I clearly gave examples of other ways that workers can be replaced, whether it's through external contractors and consultants, as I outlined in my intervention, or whether it's from foreign replacement workers, and that is a term that was actually used by building trades in their letter to the Prime Minister. So there are other ways I was referencing that replacement workers can affect workers. It is a way of replacing workers, although in fact the legislation it is a very specific way of deeming it. But there are other ways that workers can be replaced, and that's what I was referencing in my intervention. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire, the honourable member for Edmonton Greespa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Conservatives, I find it comedic in some ways that they now, at this final hour when this bill's been tabled 8 times, are likely to vote in favor because they know New Democrats have forced the vote on this, and they know that it's going to pass. And so I find it comedic that now they're trying to play as if they've never seen this bill ever before. It's been tabled 8 times in this House. They failed to vote for it 8 times, Mr. Speaker. What explanation can that member give to why they voted against it so many times?
That's right.
The Honourable Member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And what I find comedic is actually the NDP member not acknowledging that he's actually part of the government. He's in a coalition with the government, and this coalition agreement. And he's chirping me right now. He won't even allow me to actually answer the question. So this is the trend from this particular member, and it's unbelievable that this member is in a coalition and yet actually is asking that type of question. As I referenced, we have Bill C-58 in front of us. That's what we're debating here today. That's what we're going to be voting on soon, and that's what's before us. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
For a quick interaction, the Honourable Member for South Shore St. Margaret's.
There have been some interesting interventions from the Liberals, the NDP Liberals, but they know about an inch deep on a lot of issues. So let me provide a little more color and give the member an opportunity to do this on the particular issue of foreign replacement workers and Stellantis. The Canadian Building and Trades Council, a union, has condemned this government for their use of foreign replacement workers for non-proprietary jobs at Stellantis, things like forklift drivers. They've got over 138 members sitting at home unemployed in Windsor, while this government allows Stellantis to bring in over 900 construction workers, most of them in non-proprietary issues. So I'd like to have the member comment on why it is she thinks that this government talks out of one side of their mouth when they're in the chamber on legislation, but when they're administering the law, actually does the opposite.
The Honourable Member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. Well, this government does have quite a trend of doing great photo ops and lots of announcements, but their follow through really isn't great. I mean, they time and time again we see that from this government, and I do have here the letter that was sent by the Canada's Building Trades Union, and it's very to the point to the Prime Minister of their concerns, and their concerns have not been eliminated. Their concerns have not been addressed, and this government continues to deflect and be evasive on this issue. They're not being transparent. As I mentioned, a number of my colleagues at different committees, and including at our committee, had tried to get information on the contracts in order to protect workers. And if the government really had nothing to hide, then why would they not be disclosing these contracts?
Well done.
Statements by members. Déclaration de député. L'honorable député de Nepean.
The Honourable Member for Nepean.
Speaker, recently I was pleased to attend the opening of Hollier House, an affordable housing structure which has funding of $2.72 million from the federal government. Hollier House is a new 4-story, 35-unit mixed-use apartment building in Ottawa's West End, the Bells Corners neighborhood. The building also is home to a community health and resource center, or the Western Ottawa Community Resource Center, and FAMSAC food cupboard. The federal government funded $100,000 for the community room located in Hollier House. Thanks to Anglican Diocese of Ottawa and the Christchurch Bells Corners for making this possible. This is an excellent example where our federal government has partnered with a willing organization to meet the mutually shared objective of addressing affordable housing and other needs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Saskatoon Grasswoods.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to congratulate my member of the Legislative Assembly in Saskatchewan, Don Morgan, on his retirement coming up this fall. Don graduated from the University of Saskatchewan College of Law in 1978. Between 1988 and 1992, he was chair and CEO of Saskatchewan Legal Aid Commission and was appointed as King's Counsel in 1990. Don was first elected to the Legislative Assembly in November of 2003 for the Sask Party and has served ever since. He had a number of portfolios: Minister of Justice and Attorney General, Minister of Education, Minister of Advanced Education, and many more. Don served his constituents of Saskatoon Southeast faithfully, and he will be deeply missed. Congratulations, Don, on your upcoming retirement. It's well deserved.
The honourable member for Milton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As Canadians, we join in the celebration of Africa Day with immense respect and admiration for the continent's rich history, cultural diversity, and remarkable achievements. Africa Day is a powerful reminder of the enduring ties between Canada and Africa. These ties are rooted in the shared values of democracy, human rights, and sustainable development. The riding of Milton is fortunate to have a beautiful, diverse, growing African community. It is a vibrant community which reminds us of the beauty of life and values of the African continent. I have had the honor of visiting many places in Africa: Morocco, Egypt, Tanzania, Madagascar, Mali, Liberia, and Benin. I have also climbed Kilimanjaro twice to raise money for NGOs like Right to Play and WaterAid, and I look forward to visiting the great continent of Africa once again. Let us celebrate Africa Day and continue to work towards peace, prosperity, and solidarity, both at home and abroad. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for South Okanagan West Kootenay.
Mr. Speaker, I want to pay tribute to three great Canadians who recently passed away. Jerome Abraham struggled with addiction for many years before entering the recovery program at Discovery House in Penticton. After treatment, he went on to lead Discovery House through a period of dramatic growth, helping so many men get their lives back and return to their families. We lost Jerome to cancer earlier this spring, but will always be inspired by his legacy. Laura Savinkoff was the center, the heart of a very active peace community based in Grand Forks. I last saw Laura at a workshop she organized to discuss the horrific situation in Gaza. She died suddenly 2 weeks later, gone too soon, but we will remember her spirit. Finally, I want to mention the passing of Dr. Bruce Falls, a noted scientist and humble champion of nature conservation in Canada. Bruce died last month at the age of 100 after a lifetime of inspiring service to his country.
The honourable member for Sydney, Victoria.
Mr. Speaker, our love of music brings us together as Canadians, but it's tough for our working musicians right now. This week, I spoke to Juno-winning musicians who spoke to the struggles of being a musician because of anti-competitive ticketing companies. Thankfully, the United States Justice Department has moved forward on an antitrust lawsuit against Ticketmaster and Live Nation Entertainment for their anti-competitive practices. With this monopoly, it's hard for Canadians fans to support our local musicians and venues. Our world-class artists deserve full crowds and vibrant local venues. Our government has strengthened the powers of the Competition Bureau, invested historic amounts in arts and culture, including the Canada Music Fund, and supported live events through the boosted Canada Arts Presentation Fund. Mr. Speaker, let's even the playing field so that the working recording artists and musicians that create the music can thrive rather than ticketing monopolies that squeeze our hardworking musicians.
The honourable member for Perth Wellington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 80 years ago this week, the brave soldiers of the Perth Regiment were fighting in the Cassino region of Italy. On May 26, 1944, shortly after the Hitler line was breached, the Perth Regiment moved into the Leary Valley, where they were heavily shelled by the enemy. But the brave fighting Perths advanced forward. Over the next several days, they crossed the Leary River and liberated the town of Cipriano and moved forward to Armanara. Several Canadian heroes made the ultimate sacrifice. Among them were Corporal John McRobb of St. Mary's and Private William Simpson and Private Jack Bailey, both of Stratford. Private Wilfred Scott of Cromarty, who was serving with the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment, also lost his life in that battle. Days later, the world's attention would turn to D-Day, but we must never forget the courage of those who fought and those who fell in the Italian campaign. Mr. Speaker, we will remember them.
Hear, hear.
The honourable member for Yukon.
Illegitimus non carborundum. That was the defiant motto of the White Horse Star, Mr. Speaker, a paper which this week published its last edition after serving the Yukon for 124 years. First published from a tent, the White Horse Star is a living record of the Yukon's colourful history. Fire and flood, disasters, royal visits and funerals, elections at all levels, First Nations signing of modern treaties, plane crashes, even White Horse's own dramatic events on September 11th, 2001. Further back is the story of the Dawson City Nuggets and their intrepid journey to Ottawa in 1905 to challenge for the Stanley Cup. In more modern times, it seemed not a single event occurred where the Star was not there to capture the scene with photos or a story. The Star was local news at its best, connecting Yukoners from the local to national and international events and personages. This Star has set, but local news must go on. Thank you to the many dedicated staff who made the White Horse Star come alive day after day. Illegitimus non carborundum. Don't let them grind you down, Mr. Speaker.
Congratulations. The honourable member for Burlington, we'll try that again. Oakville North Burlington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Canada came to Oakville last week when the Junior A Hockey National Championship was hosted at 16 Mile Arena by the town of Oakville and the Oakville Blades. Players and fans from across Canada came out to see their favourite teams battle it out for the 2024 Centennial Cup. The tournament significantly benefited Oakville's thriving economy, bringing in more than $5 million in economic benefit. I attended the thrilling final game when the Collingwood Blues beat the Melfort Mustangs 1-0 to win the 2024 Centennial Cup. Congratulations to Collingwood on their national championship win, and to the Calgary Canucks' Julian Gervais, who won the tournament Most Valuable Player. 16 Mile Arena is the only venue in Canada that has hosted major national events for Hockey Canada, Skate Canada, and Curling Canada. Huge thanks to Todd Carey, manager of 16 Mile Sports Complex, Jamie Angus, and the team for another successful event. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Calgary Shepherd.
After 9 years of this NDP Liberal government, more Canadians are hungry and homeless. The latest Salvation Army report reveals alarming statistics. 68% of Canadians now rely on discounted food, and 44% have to cut the grocery bills just to make ends meet. A staggering 40% are forced to buy less nutritious food due to cost, while 26% skip meals because they can't afford groceries. That same report now says that 1 in 4 young adults are relying on food banks. The Calgary Food Bank report says that 44% of their users are feeling worse off than they did last year. With so many empty stomachs and families continuing to struggle to get affordable food onto their tables, what is the NDP Liberal government's solution? Why? It's more big government greed. It's higher carbon taxes, more payroll taxes, and more tax on tax. Now, the residents of Calgary Shepherd know that this Prime Minister is just not worth the cost. And what they want is a common-sense Conservative government, and they want it now. A government that will axe the tax, build the homes, fix the budget, and stop the crime. Let's bring it home, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Lac Saint Louis.
In my riding of Lac Saint Louis provides a resting place for over 17,000 military service members and their immediate families. It is also a valued space for the community to regularly gather to honour those who have served and fought for Canada. Dimanche prochain, d'anciens combattants.
On Sunday, veterans, families, and many others will gather at the National Field of Honour in the company of the French ambassador to Canada. Together, they will celebrate the 80th anniversary of D-Day, which was a decisive turning point in the Second World War, made possible by the courageous participation of Canadian soldiers.
I invite any members who may be in the area this Sunday to attend the ceremony. At the same time, it is my hope that the government will soon be able to assume ownership of the Field of Honour and accord it official status as a national military cemetery.
The honourable member for Regina, Wascana.
Mr. Speaker, after 9 years of this Liberal NDP Prime Minister, more Canadians than ever are hungry and homeless. The government recently promised to end chronic homelessness in Canada by 2030. But according to the Parliamentary Budget Officer, chronic homelessness is up 38% under the Liberals' watch. and fully 80% of homeless individuals in this country are homeless purely because of affordability reasons. The Parliamentary Budget Officer's findings may come as a surprise to this out-of-touch government, but they come as no surprise to ordinary Canadians. More and more young people are unable to move out of their parents' basements, and those who do often find themselves turning to food banks just to make ends meet. This is the reality after 9 years of the Liberals and their NDP coalition partners. Everything is broken, and we need a new Conservative government to clean up the mess.
The honourable member for King Vaughan.
Mr. Speaker, a D-. That is what this NDP Liberal government scored in the 2024 Food Bank Canada report card. A D-. A failing grade. A failing government. Poverty and food insecurity continues to climb. The Dam Food Bank that services 26 municipalities in the GTA reported an increase of 36% visits by seniors. In the month of April, they serviced 60,000 families, a jump from 29,000 in February. This is shameful. Seniors need help. Canadians need help. But this Prime Minister is not listening. If your children came home with a D-, any parent would hold them accountable. This NDP Liberal government needs to be held accountable. This Prime Minister is just not worth the cost. Listen to Canadians, get out of the way, and let Conservatives fix what you have broken.
I just need to remind honourable members to run that through the chair, and I feel ashamed. The honourable member for Ottawa West Nepean.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the UN voted to establish the International Day of Reflection and Commemoration of the 1995 genocide in Srebrenica. 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men and boys were taken by Serb forces from a UN safe zone, shot and buried in mass graves. After years of painstaking documentation, in 2004 and 2007, international courts ruled that the crimes committed in Srebrenica constitute genocide. 25 years ago, I was working in Sarajevo. Every morning, I passed the mothers of Srebrenica, holding photos of their lost sons, begging us for justice. Like one mother who searched all of the mass graves for the red rubber boots that her little boy was wearing on that day. Those faces haunt me still. I hope that by commemorating these atrocities, it will bring some peace and some healing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Winnipeg Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many youth in Winnipeg Centre face unimaginable hurdles to success. We have among the highest rate of child poverty in the country at almost 40%. But Winnipeg's frontlines organizations are leading the way and rising to this challenge. This includes Resource Assistance for Youth Incorporated, otherwise known as RAY, that provides support services and training programs to youth who are most marginalized by systems, such as the Level Up Education and Work Placement Program, which has empowered 775 youth to join labor markets or post-secondary education. But funding delays by the Liberal government are putting this program at risk, forcing layoffs for 12 staff members and eliminating services for 80 youth at risk. Lives are on the line if we fail to get this funding in our community. All young people deserve opportunities to thrive, and the Liberals must end funding delays and give RAY the resources it needs to empower Winnipeg's youth. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Drummond. Mr. Speaker, Drummond has been on cloud 9 ever since our Voltigeurs won the Quebec Major Junior Hockey League's President's Cup in 4 games in front of ecstatic fans at a packed Centre Marcel Dionne. We were treated to some truly brilliant performances. First, there was the unstoppable goalie, Riley Mercer, who frustrated opponents with his incredible performances throughout the playoffs. Then Voslavod Komarov in the running for the Canadian Hockey League Defenseman of the Year. And then there's Ethan Gauthier, a young player from Drummond, the third member of his family to wear the Rouge uniform after his father Denis and brother Kayland. Ethan was the team's top scorer and second in the entire league. He kept us on the edge of our seats all season, Mr. Speaker, and we will continue to be on the edge of our seats thanks to him for a long time, I'm sure. 2024 will go down in Drummondville hockey history forever. The Voltigeurs this weekend will be playing in the Memorial Cup, and this time all of Quebec stands behind them. In Drummond, we are ready to win 2 trophies in a row. Go Voltigeurs, go!
The honourable member for Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, and Rideau Lakes.
Food inflation has risen to a 40-year high, and food banks across the country are seeing record demand. Canadians that once donated to their local food banks are now standing in line to receive help. People are skipping meals because they can't afford 3 meals per day. It's a sad, sad story, but this is the record of the sellout NDP leader. Since he joined the Liberal government, life has gotten more expensive. Maybe it's because his brother is a top lobbyist for Metro, or maybe it's because he sold out our farmers and working class Canadians by repeatedly raising taxes on them. Either way, we know the only thing that the NDP leader is looking out for is his own pension. Canadians in southern and northern Ontario, Hamilton, Edmonton, and British Columbia are turning their backs on the NDP and turning towards common sense conservatives in record numbers. Conservatives represent a return to normal where hard work is rewarded, and not just for those that drive a BMW or wear a Rolex. Conservatives are going to bring it home.
The honourable member for Brampton East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in honor of Nurses Week to recognize and celebrate the incredible contribution of nurses who are true heroes of our medical system. The theme of this year's Nurses Week was changing lives and shaping tomorrow. And this statement is certainly true. Nurses play a critical role in our healthcare system and in the future of our health. They are often the first point for contact for patients, providing compassionate care, emotional support, and expert medical treatment directly impacting their lives. I would like to especially celebrate the incredible nurses of my riding of Brampton East, who are part of the team at Brampton Civic Hospital and medical offices across Brampton, and acknowledge all their hard work and dedication. To all the nurses and healthcare heroes across the country, thank you for your unwavering commitment and service. Your efforts do not go unnoticed, and we are deeply grateful for everything you do to keep our communities healthy. Thank you.
Oral questions, question orale. The honourable member for Haldimand Norfolk.
After 9 years, this Liberal NDP government is just not worth the cost of homelessness and hunger that Canadians are facing. Even Canadians who own their own homes are worried that they will become homeless when they have to renew their mortgages at much higher interest rates. Some payments will even triple, according to a new report. When will this government rein in their inflationary spending so more Canadians don't have to worry about homelessness?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, it's certainly well known that grocery price inflation is a problem that all countries are facing around the world. Grocery price inflation in Canada, there's some good news that just came in with a report that shows that food price inflation is in fact coming down in Canada. It's at 1.4% in April, down from 1.9% from the month before. That is certainly encouraging news for Canadians, but it's cold comfort for sure. We're actually addressing the root causes of the issue by increasing competition in the marketplace and investing in a national school food program. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Haldimand Norfolk.
After 9 years, grocery prices have actually gone up under this Liberal NDP government. And now Canadians are facing hunger and homelessness at unprecedented rates. This Liberal NDP Prime Minister is just not worth the cost. Of the mortgages outstanding as of February 2024, 76% of them will be up for renewal in 2026. When will this Liberal NDP Prime Minister stop his inflationary spending so Canadians can afford food and shelter once again?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, let's note, first of all, that this is the same member who called for Canada to exit the United Nations. This is the same member who sat down with other members of her caucus with far-right European politicians. But to the substance of the question, she talks about homelessness. She ought to read the most recent report of the Parliamentary Budget Officer that makes clear that no less than 50,000 Canadians have been supported by this government's national housing strategy, and specifically the Reaching Home program, that they would cut because they have an austerity agenda that they are ideologically committed to, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Haldeman-Norfolk.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberals love to deflect away from Canadian suffering. The facts are, after 9 years of this Liberal NDP government, they are still not worth the cost of homelessness and hunger that Canadians are feeling. According to the Parliamentary Budget Officer, chronic homelessness is up 38% across Canada. Nearly 80% of all homeless people say they just can't afford a home to live in. When will this NDP Liberal government cap their inflationary spending and build the homes that Canadians need to live in dignity?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And again, ironic coming from a member who has been advocating and has actually written a petition to this House of Commons for Canada to leave the United Nations altogether. We see yet again more disinformation from the Conservative members on climate change and affordability, two issues that they either don't understand or simply don't care about. If they did care, they would acknowledge that Canada is reducing our pollution and inflation is coming down. But the Leader of the Opposition wants to scrap it all. He doesn't want Canadians to receive their Canada carbon rebate on July 15th. He just wants to make sure his rich oil and gas friends can pollute even more and get even richer, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, after 9 years of this Prime Minister, more and more Quebecers are hungry. I was in Abitibi last week, and at the Rwanda Food Bank, there's a very worrisome situation. 54% of the people who go there have a job. We're talking about people who work, who have a paycheck, who have money but don't have enough of it to buy food. That's Canada after 9 years of this Liberal government, with the Bloc blindly voting for $500 billion in inflationary spending. Is the government aware of this waste? The Honourable Minister, my colleague across the way, seems unaware of what we've lived through the past few years. We've been there for people, although they want to cut everywhere. We are here for food security. We have a school food program in partnership with programs. We also have the Canada Child Benefit. Remember when they were in power, they gave everyone the same check. But we have lifted many children out of poverty. The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent. Things are working so well. Look what happens in my riding of Lorettaville area. It's an unusual situation, something I thought I'd never see in my lifetime. On a website, someone wrote, I was wondering if someone could trade me 2 or 3 home-cooked meals for some work. I can fix just about anything. Mr. Speaker, we're talking about a man asking for food. That's what's happening after 9 years of this government. Is the government is aware that when they rack up compulsive deficits, we're left with this situation. The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, true, people are having a hard time. Also in my riding, I visit people and across the province and the country as well. We meet with people at food banks and with our partners. We went through a pandemic and abnormal inflation, but inflation is coming down. And because we are making the right decisions and focusing our investment and help on people who have the most need, the greatest need. The Honourable Member from Manicouagan again. Mr. Speaker, the Liberals showed up yesterday to save the chair of the Francophonie Association. And do you know what he said? Mr. Speaker, can I start again? Thank you. The Liberal cavalry marched in yesterday to save the chair of the Canadian Francophonie Assembly. The Honourable Member from Manicouagan. Mr. Speaker, the Liberal cavalry showed up yesterday to save the president. This is obstruction. I'll try a third time. The Honourable Member for Manicouagan. Mr. Speaker, the Liberal cavalry showed up yesterday to save the president of the Parliamentary Francophonie Assembly, and they needed interpreters at the French-speaking association because many of these members didn't speak French. The result, the chair remains in place even though he made very vexing comments. Is this government serious? Do they really think that the credibility of this association has increased? Do they seriously think that this episode has served the French-speaking community here and elsewhere? The Honourable Government House Leader. Mr. Speaker, this criticism of the representative of the Canadian Francophonie does them a great dishonor. People realize that when the time comes to decide whether or not we're going to support people who stand up for Canadian Francophones, the Bloc is mysteriously absent from these debates. We are proud of our colleague. His president of the assembly and shows is to his honor, and we want to support him more. Mr. Speaker, when the Bloc defends all Francophones against violence, insults, I think we're doing our work for all Francophones. A few articles this morning, there was a confidence vote saved by this Liberal cavalry. Also, the president of the APF. That's the result of this Liberal operation. They also insulted witnesses. No problem, because in Liberals defend each other, but they don't defend the French-speaking community. And something they did do was weaken a parliamentary association, the Honourable Government House Leader. What weakens this assembly is not having more members. It's that the Bloc is criticizing a member that has apologized on several occasions for what he said and continues to defend Francophones across Canada and continues to honor us as the chair of this global organization, which is welcoming to ready to receive people shortly. And we are all going to be behind the president of the APS in his functions.
TT is life, and access to safe drinking water is a human right. But in Nunavut, only 8 out of 25 water treatment facilities passed their health and safety tests. The result is a very real possibility of unsafe drinking water for the people of Nunavut. Liberals have neglected to provide healthy drinking water for Indigenous communities. Will the Liberals act urgently to provide the funding that ensures Nunavut communities have clean, safe drinking water now?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And we know that it's unacceptable to have any communities without access to clean drinking water in this country. We've worked really hard at the first time in our government's history, actually, to put forward record investments around this. Right now, there are existing 28 long-term drinking water advisories, and we have a project underway for every single one of them. We've already lifted 144 long-term drinking water advisories since 2015. 96% of First Nations still have access to their clean water, and we're going to make sure that it stays that way. Particularly the further north, where there's ongoing challenges that are specific to their region, we're going to make sure to work with them for an Indigenous-led, Inuit-led solution to this problem. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cowichan-Malahat-Langford.
More than 9,000 border workers have voted for a strike mandate. The Liberals keep asking more and more of these workers, like cracking down on stolen cars being smuggled out of Canada, but won't give them the resources they need. Our CBSA workers deserve better. They deserve a pension, better working conditions, and respect. Canadians depend on these workers to keep us safe, but the Liberals are turning their backs on them. Will the Liberals admit that by failing to provide a fair retirement to these workers, they're setting the stage for unnecessary disruptions this summer?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, our government is definitely committed to reaching agreements with all of our different public service unions that are both fair to the employees and reasonable to taxpayers. We've already reached agreements with 17 different bargaining units that cover over 80% of representative employees. The best deals are found at the table. We urge the union to come to the table. We are happy to negotiate with them.
The honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Mr. Speaker, the Superintendent of Financial Institutions released his annual risk outlook yesterday. It's now a warning from their own regulator for this Liberal NDP government to heed. Canadian homeowners who renew their mortgages over the next 2 years could face a payment shock. A payment shock. The root cause of this spike in payments is this government's loose spending policies. Large deficits have driven inflation, which have increased mortgage costs. With all these warnings, will the Minister of Finance take a lesson and reverse her inflationary spending policies?
Hear, hear. Well, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Recently, let's take note, the Parliamentary Budget Officer just this week described Canada's fiscal position as top of class. And so did the International Monetary Fund when describing Canada's growth in 2025. We're also, I remind the Conservatives, rated #1 in the world with a AAA credit rating, which has been reaffirmed by independent credit agencies. And when it comes to combating inflation, the Governor of the Bank of Canada says we're on the right track. So let me ask the Conservatives this. Does the Conservative leader intend to fire all the independent experts in the world that disagree with his doomsday narrative?
The honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Mr. Speaker, that's avoiding every touch point he doesn't want to pay attention to, including from his own regulator. Let's look at the follow-on risks that OSFI identified. Stress in the mortgage insurance industry, investment portfolio risk, asset management risk, insurance risk, all rising. This house of cards does not end well. It's obvious to the regulator and to all Canadians that after 9 years of failed economic policies, this government is just not worth the cost. Can we see a redo on last month's disastrous budget that will bring back the fiscal balance Canadians desperately need?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, Minister of Housing and Infrastructure.
At any point in time, a democracy is bound to face risk, particularly in a difficult economic environment that we face domestically and internationally, Mr. Speaker. But what I would say to the member, to echo my colleague who just spoke on this side, a AAA credit rating, affirmed recently by Moody's, who said that we have the best fiscal record in the G7, the lowest debt and deficit in the G7. Those are foundation points, Mr. Speaker, that will carry us through difficult times. And it is a hard time for Canadians. He talks about those Canadians who want to renew their mortgage. Where were they over the years? We wanted to support them. They were never there.
The honourable member for Charleswood, St. James, Assiniboia, Headingley.
In 2020, the Prime Minister's own bank governor said interest rates are very low and they're going to be low for a long time. This week, OSFI reported that mortgage holders will face a payment shock because of high interest rates. They said the shock will be the worst for those who took low mortgage rates in 2020. Words matter. After 9 years of this NDP Liberal Prime Minister misleading Canadians, will he finally admit he's not worth the cost to homeowners?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, it was great to have the independent governor of the Bank of Canada attend Finance Committee recently. And let me quote him in saying, when he was at committee, he said, and I quote, "The budget does respect the fiscal guardrails that the government put in place, and that keeping the net debt to GDP ratio on a declining track, and importantly, keeping deficits below 1% of GDP in future years. The budget also commits to those guardrails going forward, and that is helpful." That's exactly the words of the independent Bank of Canada governor. I wonder if this is why the Conservative leader wants to fire the independent.
The honourable member for Charleswood, St. James, Assiniboia, Headingley.
Also in 2020, the Prime Minister said interest rates are at historic lows, Glenn. Millions of people took out low-interest mortgages. Tuesday, his own bank regulators reported that homeowners renewing mortgages will now face a payment shock because of high mortgage rates they got in 2020, increasing the risk of default. After 9 years of this NDP Liberal Prime Minister misleading Canadians, will he finally admit he is not worth the cost to people who are losing their homes?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, Canada is proud of having one of the most stable and flexible financial institutions and financial markets in the world. Right. It is also true that Canada's fiscal position is a particularly strong one. What would put that all at risk, Mr. Speaker? the Banana Republic promise of the Leader of the Opposition to fire the Governor of the Bank of Canada, sending shockwaves to global markets and exposing homeowners, mortgage holders, to intense interest rate risk.
The honourable member for Calgary-Shepherd.
After 9 years of this NDP Liberal Prime Minister, more Canadians are now going hungry and homeless, and the latest annual risk outlook from OSFI highlights that 76% of mortgages will come up for renewal by the end of 2026. Now, the Prime Minister's high mortgage rates are creating misery for Canadian homeowners. And again, the Liberal government's own bank regulators flashing red stop signs. The Bank of Canada governor has said that out-of-control federal spending is not helpful. How much more mortgage payment pain will Canadian families have to face and endure to satisfy this NDP Liberal government's big government spending?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
That member should know better than to stand up and talk about financial markets when his own leader is the person that has promised to send tremors into the international financial system by taking over like some dictator the operations of the Bank of Canada and arbitrarily firing the governor. The governor, who, of course, is watching inflation very carefully, and I know he will have noticed that inflation for the fourth straight month is down to the Bank of Canada's target range, and we want to continue getting that inflation number down.
The honourable member for Calgary-Shepherd.
Well, that overheated and over-the-top rhetoric is cold comfort to homeowners who are facing hundreds of dollars per month of increased mortgage costs because of their decisions during the pandemic. They doubled the national debt. They increased spending by $600 billion over that time period. That led to higher mortgage interest costs. At the same time, when the Prime Minister was saying that interest rates would never go up, they are so low they could continue. And mortgage holders listened to him. They took out more mortgages, and now they're facing higher mortgage rates, so punishing they have a hard time paying for it. So my question to him is, when is the NDP Liberal Prime Minister going to learn his lesson, and is he going to give homeowners a break on these mortgage rates?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
I would take the member seriously, Mr. Speaker, were it not for the Conservative record. Those same mortgage holders in years past benefited from a tax cut to the middle class that this government introduced. They benefited from the Canada Child Benefit. They're benefiting now from the child care program this government has introduced. Dental care where they are eligible. Pharmacare, Mr. Speaker. All those measures that benefit middle-income Canadians and lower-income Canadians working hard to join the middle class are measures that they did not support at all. And they want to fire the Governor of the Bank of Canada. That's irresponsible. They never answered the question on that.
The honourable member for Montigny. Climate change is threatening the St. Lawrence River. That's what federal government scientists revealed on Wednesday. Water temperatures have reached record levels, up to 5 degrees above average. Water is depleted of oxygen, and as a result, species such as shrimp are in serious decline. Biodiversity and the economy of our regions are at risk. And yet, while federal scientists are sounding the alarm, the federal government is opening a new pipeline in the West to encourage dependence on dirty oil. Frankly, right in the middle of a climate crisis, when will the Liberals listen to science? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. When we came to the government in 2015, Canada was even protecting 1% of its territorial waters, and we have now lifted this to 15%, and we plan to protect 30% by 2030. This is an objective that we agreed to at COP15 in Montreal. We are investing record amounts in partnership with Indigenous peoples across the country to protect a greater portion of our territory. The Honourable Member for Repentigny. The St. Lawrence River is the beating heart of Quebec. It's the cradle of the Quebec nation, which has developed along its bank for 4 centuries. And today, we see that climate change is attacking these shores, threatening biodiversity and jeopardizing the survival of species that have been fished for generations. Meanwhile, the federal government is investing $34 billion in a dirty oil pipeline, the primary cause of global warming. Ottawa is literally making Quebecers pay for damaging their own ecosystems. How much longer will we accept entrusting our money to this irresponsible country? The Honourable Government House Leader. Mr. Speaker, the Bloc can't be serious. You have before us the first government that has credible targets and a plan to reach net zero by 2050. You have a government that is taking care of its oceans and is fighting against plastics with a series of measures that will ensure that Canada will reach its Paris targets and fight climate change, and also including in the St. Lawrence River.
Carlton Trail, Eagle Creek.
After 9 years of this NDP Liberal Prime Minister, more Canadians are hungry and homeless. The number of tent cities is growing across the country, and the number of people lining up at food banks has grown to over 2 million and continues to climb. The Salvation Army reports that 26% of Canadians are skipping or reducing meals. This Prime Minister is not worth the cost. When will he finally stop his inflationary spending, which is forcing Canadians to go hungry?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing.
Mr. Speaker, in that constituency of the member where individuals might find themselves homeless, she can go back and show the Leader of the Opposition's housing plan that unfortunately says nothing about homelessness. Zero, Mr. Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition purports to present a vision for this country. It is hollow, Mr. Speaker. There is nothing there on so many issues, but specifically on homelessness. He's never cared about these issues, Mr. Speaker. When it comes to supporting Canadians on a range of matters, from homelessness to childcare to pharmacare to dental care, they have been silent. They don't care.
The Honourable Member for Carlton Trail, Eagle Creek.
Here are the facts. After 9 years of this NDP Liberal Prime Minister, more Canadians are losing their homes and going hungry. The number of Canadians reported food security challenges has increased, and 26% are skipping meals. Costs continue to rise, and this government's plan to raise taxes will only make it worse. Canadians are losing hope. This Prime Minister is not worth the cost. When will he finally admit his inflationary policies are hurting Canadians?
Right. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, our government has a track record of leading with compassion and addressing and leading programs, initiating programs that address the needs of the most vulnerable. Emergency food programs are certainly part of that support system that people need who have immediate needs and are struggling to put food on the table. But let's just review. Food Banks Canada said that the National School Food Program was a vital initiative. If the Conservatives are aligning themselves with Food Banks Canada, then why would they oppose a vital initiative of a National School Food Program that's going to feed over 400,000 children?
The Honourable Member for Cumberland-Colchester.
Speaker, after 9 years of this NDP Liberal Prime Minister, more Canadians are hungry and homeless. The Salvation Army is reporting that 26% of Canadians have been forced to skip meals because they cannot afford to buy groceries. Our country is suffering under this government and its Prime Minister, who is not worth the cost. When will this Prime Minister axe the tax so that Canadians can afford to eat again?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Food Banks Canada and their member organizations right across this country, they do essential work and they do important research, and I want to thank them for that. And they actually make some recommendations in this report, which the Conservatives have clearly not read. They recommend more supports for the working poor, like our Canada Workers Benefit. They recommend improved Social Security, which Conservatives gutted when they were in power, while we've increased, improved, and modernized the Canada Child Benefit and brought forward the Canada Disability Benefit. Mr. Speaker, while the Conservatives continue to put words in the mouths of poverty elimination experts and Food Banks Canada, we'll continue to put food on the table with the National School Food Program, improve the National Canada Child Benefit, and put money in the pockets with the Canada Card.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland-Colchester.
Well, thanks, Speaker. It's interesting. Yesterday, the member from Milton at a meeting said he was shocked to hear the report of how many Canadians were actually hungry. So even though they're continuing to announce programs to fix the problems they've created, we need a significant change in government. Once again, Speaker, according to the Salvation Army, parents are skipping meals so their children and other family members can eat. Canadians should not have to live like this. After 9 years, of course, this Liberal coalition government is not worth the cost. Again, I will ask, when will the Prime Minister axe the tax so that Canadians can afford to eat again?
Hear, hear. Hear, hear. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, that member's from Atlantic Canada, and I've never heard anyone from Atlantic Canada suggest that we cut the Canada Child Benefit, that we cut and vote against the school nutrition program, that we cut an entire housing program designed to remedy the housing problems in Atlantic Canada. That member should stand up for once to that leader who has an austerity agenda and wants to cut the very supports that are keeping his constituents and helping his constituents meet the current cost of living issue.
The Honourable Member for Victoria.
Mr. Speaker, people in Victoria want to know that our coast and our endangered southern resident killer whales are protected. New reports show that cruise ships docking in Victoria are jeopardizing these orcas by dumping billions of liters of polluted wastewater into the ocean. The states have stricter laws, so under the Liberals' watch, cruise ships wait and dump in Canadian waters. They are even dumping in marine protected areas. The Liberals' regulations are woefully inadequate. And with the Conservatives, there'd be even less rules. Will the Liberals stop making the BC coast a dumping ground for polluted cruise waste?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member from Victoria for her consistent advocacy for a cleaner environment and a greener future for all of Canada. Indeed, it's refreshing to stand up and talk about how we can protect this planet and how we can fight climate change rather than if we fight climate change. Mr. Speaker, her concerns with respect to the coast and the dangers to whale species and waterborne mammals are important to us in our government, and I'd love to sit down and talk about local issues in Victoria and ensure this government is supporting all of those vital endangered species. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton-Griesbach.
Mr. Speaker, CKUA is a source of music, arts, and community as one of Edmonton's most beloved public broadcasters. But they're facing a perfect storm with the inflation and cost of living crisis. They need our help during these tough times. While other Canadian broadcasters receive federal help in similar circumstances, CKUA is being left behind. CKUA supports local Canadian artists and brings Edmontonians together. Will the Liberals stand up for Edmonton and our local media and help out CKUA in their time of need, or will they continue to ignore them?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Canadian Heritage.
I thank the Honourable Member for his question and for his advocacy on this important issue. Our government has been there to support media from across this country, from coast to coast to coast, from small communities to large ones. Much of the support for small communities would have been flowing had Conservatives not chosen to obstruct the passage of legislation that would have had money flowing to small community broadcasters across this country. We're going to keep working hard for those broadcasters, and we're not going to stop until Canadians have that voice from coast to coast to coast.
The Honourable Member for Kitchener South, Hespeler.
Mr. Speaker, on Monday our government unveiled a national action plan on combating auto theft. This plan will work in conjunction with Budget 2024 to keep communities safe from auto theft crime. Insurance crime experts have already called the plan a turning point for auto theft in Canada. Can the Minister of Justice please highlight one of the concrete steps in this national plan that will make communities safer?
The Honourable Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada.
Mr. Speaker, the rise in auto theft in our country is not caused by one-off incidents of teenagers taking a joyride. It's perpetrated by networks of organized criminals. That's why we're cracking down on organized crime. These crime rings prey on teenagers to do their dirty work. So we're adding an amendment to the criminal code to add a new aggravating factor to make for tougher sentences for those who use young persons in the commission of an offense. We're also raising the maximum penalty for those who would use violence during a daylight carjacking. We're going to stop auto theft. We're going to stop organized criminals who are taking advantage of our kids. Mr. Speaker, enough is enough.
The Honourable Member for Portage-Lisgar.
After 9 years of this NDP Liberal government, more Canadians are hungry and homeless than ever before. 1 in 4 Manitobans don't have enough money to buy groceries and feed their families. Home prices are out of control and rent has skyrocketed to the point that people can't afford to put a roof over their head. How can this Prime Minister keep a straight face and try to tell 40% of Manitobans now paying more than 30% of their income on housing that everything in this country is in fact fine? or are Manitobans just experiencing it differently?
Whoa. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, I apologize in advance for not being able to take the Conservative Party seriously with their newfound empathy for Canadians that are struggling with the cost of living. They are not willing to step up anytime our compassionate government leads with responsible solutions that try to lift people up who are vulnerable. The Conservatives vote against. They vote against dental care, child care, pharmacare. They vote against a national school food program. How on earth can we expect anyone to take their new feigned interest in Canadians who are struggling seriously?
The Honourable Member for Yellowhead.
After 9 years of this NDP Liberal Prime Minister, more Canadians are hungry and homeless. Food insecurity in Alberta is now over 27%. And just yesterday, the Edson Food Bank shared their latest data with me. They're now dealing with almost triple the food bank usage compared to 2020. This Prime Minister is just not worth the cost. Will he stop his reckless inflationary spending and cancel the quadrupling of the carbon tax so Canadians can afford to put food on their table?
The Honourable Minister of Families.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to share today some of the feedback on our announcement of a national school food program in Budget 2024. The Coalition for Healthy School Food released a statement applauding the federal government for the investment and urging all provinces and territories to sign on to this new policy to provide nutritious, culturally appropriate, sustainable and affordable food to school children across this country. On this side of the House, we'll continue to make investments in children and family. On that side of the House, they need to explain to Canadians why they won't support feeding children.
The Honourable Member for Saskatoon-Grasswood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After 9 years of this NDP Liberal Prime Minister, more Canadians are hungry and homeless. 1 in 4 Canadians are experiencing food insecurity. Food Banks Canada even gave this NDP Liberal government a failing grade. 40% of Saskatchewan residents have visited a food bank. 35% are worried about putting a meal on the table for their family. This Prime Minister is not worth the cost. So why does he tell Canadians we've never had it so good?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this is rich coming from people who sat in the government that led through Canada's worst economic performance in the last 30 years after the 2008 financial crisis. They had no idea what to do, no idea how to get Canadians back on their feet. We have gone through a global pandemic, Mr. Speaker. We have put in place measures to not just save businesses, but people's livelihoods, to get this country back on its feet. 130% employment since before the pandemic, Mr. Speaker. They want to cut the Canada carbon rebate. They want to cut the Canada child benefit. They're cuts. We're here to support Canadians each and every day.
The Honourable Member for Oshawa.
After 9 years, this Prime Minister is not worth the cost. According to the 2024 Poverty Report, 44% of Canadians are paying more than 30% of income on housing, which is a big F for this government. Mr. Speaker, this NDP Liberal government only gets an A+ when it comes to creating disastrous policies. The member from Whitby previously stated we are going to have to switch our lifestyles and it's going to be painful. Mr. Speaker, is this the kind of pain he was talking about? How much more pain will this Liberal NDP government intentionally inflict upon Canadians before they axe the carbon tax? That's right.
The Honourable Minister of Rural Economic Development.
Mr. Speaker, I really find it quite rich coming from the party opposite. We've been trying to get the fall economic statement passed because that's going to give the members in the rural parts of his riding a family of four, an extra $1,344 a year. That's what we're doing for Canadians all across this country. So please, pass the fizz. We know people are having trouble with things. This is going to help people along with $10 a day daycare, along with dental care, along with, thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are doing a lot, and I know we acknowledge that. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Drummond. Yesterday, while the committee was studying an overhaul of the Court Challenges program, it was dismaying to see a block amendment rejected. A simple amendment asking just one thing, that the Court Challenges program respect the Official Languages Act. That act recognizes that French is threatened, recognizes the existence of other laws, such as the Charter of the French Language, which is designed to protect our language, and recognizes the need to foster a Francophone majority in Quebec. What's the Liberals' problem with respecting the Official Languages Act? The Honourable Minister of Justice. No? When it comes to the Court Challenges program, this is a program that was created by the Liberal Party of Canada and scrapped by the Conservatives and restored by the Liberals during our current term of office. We will strengthen French and official bilingualism all across Canada. We're defending minority language communities, and we're all in favor of protecting both official languages all across Canada, which are protected under the Constitution. The Honourable Member. Mr. Speaker, it would be nice to get some serious answers to serious questions. It's disturbing to see the government refuse to require the Court Challenges program respect federal law. Once again, the Liberals are entangled in their own contradictions over French. They still have a hard time recognizing there's only one official language that's threatened in Quebec, and that's French. So much so, in fact, that they refuse to demand that the Court Challenges program take into account their own legislation, the Official Languages Act. Why should the program ignore the different situations of English and French in Canada and in Quebec? The Honourable Minister. I have to point out to the member opposite that the Court Challenges program was set up to protect minority official languages communities from the very beginning. That was the root of the program. The very raison d'etre of this program was to protect Francophone communities outside Quebec and the English-speaking community within Quebec. So our dedication to protect and promote both official languages is shown in that. That's what we did with the Official Languages Act and what is already there, the protection that's already there in the Canadian Constitution. The Honourable Member for Montmagny. Mr. Speaker, after 9 years of this Prime Minister, more and more Quebecers are hungry and homeless. The Bloc voted for $500 billion in budgetary appropriations. They claim to represent Quebecers, but then they turn their back on them and vote for inflationary centralizing spending. Quebecers are suffering, and the Bloc is voting for more and more money for the federal government and less for Quebecers. Can the Bloc Liberal stop supporting this Prime Minister's uncontrolled spending? The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm always surprised when my Quebec colleagues say things like that. They know full well what we've been through in recent years. There was a global context affecting all of us, but luckily the Liberal government was there to help the people that needed help the most. It would have been a disaster had the Conservatives been in office. We helped those who needed the most help. There was the Canada Child Benefit. Our approach is to help only those families that need support. The Honourable Member. Mr. Speaker, after 9 years of this Prime Minister, more and more Quebecers are living with hunger, homelessness and poverty. While Canadians suffer because of inflationary Liberal policies, the Bloc continues to encourage them. Quebecers are crumbling under the weight of this broken economy. And what's the Bloc doing? Voting for $500 billion in budgetary appropriations. The Bloc and the Prime Minister are just not worth the cost. Can the Liberal Bloc show a little empathy for Quebecers and think of what they need for once? The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's a bit contradictory, what my colleague just said and what the Conservatives are saying. They propose to cut back on benefits. But what should we do? Just forget about the dental coverage that should help not just seniors, but also young people or people with disabilities who need help the most? What should we do? Where should we cut? Should we cut the school food program? Should we cut the infrastructure program? I'd like to know what they would cut to reduce spending. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Beauce. Mr. Speaker, after 9 years of this bloc-backed Liberal Prime Minister with $500 billion in inflationary centralized spending, 1 farm in 5 can't make their debt payments. Our farmers are crying out to the government. The Liberals are adding insult to injury by cutting funding to 4-H clubs all across Canada. These 17,000 young people and 7,000 volunteer leaders are training the next generation of farmers. When will this Liberal government stop hurting the agricultural sector and instead help feed our already starving population? The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My colleagues have a short memory about what the Conservatives did when they were in office. They cut back on agricultural programs, on research and innovation for agriculture. They cut hundreds of millions of dollars to help small farmers deal with crop risk. So we've been there. We've helped farmers be more resilient and more resistant to climate change, more innovative. We've helped to develop new markets as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Laval-les-Îles. Mr. Speaker, women are the driving force behind the economy. We need to equip women even better so they can pursue their dreams, succeed, and flourish. It's not just the sensible thing to do. It makes sense economically, too. Can the Minister of Employment, Workforce Development, and Official Languages tell the House what the government's doing to improve the situation of Canadian female Canadian workers? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague from Laval-les-Îles for this important question. Our government believes in setting women up for success. That's why we created $10 a day childcare. That's why contraceptives will be free under our pharmacare plan. That's why we'll always stand up for a woman's right to choose. Mr. Speaker, we support families at every opportunity. And what do the Conservatives do? They vote against every step of the way.
Saskatoon University.
After 9 years, something is rotten in the state of Canada, more specifically in Ottawa, and we all can smell it. That's why there's a public inquiry on the foreign interference in the first place. But this government is once again trying to cover it up, redacting documents they have already promised to send to the Commission. Today, I speak for all Canadians when I say we all know this Prime Minister is not worth the cost. So exactly what is the NDP Liberal coalition government hiding?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, as the Minister pointed out yesterday, the member opposite might wish to speak to his House Leader because in drafting the terms of reference for the inquiry, all parties in this House agreed to those terms, which included redactions for things like cabinet confidence and client solicitor privilege. So it's pretty insincere, Mr. Speaker, for Conservatives to agree to the process and now criticize that very process. We've been clear with Canadians, and we will continue to work to deal with foreign interference, unlike Conservatives who felt it didn't politically advantage them.
The Honourable Member for Saskatoon University.
Well, the cover-up coalition continues, Mr. Speaker. Trust is one of the most precious things. And after 9 years of this NDP Liberal government, Canadians have learned exactly how much they can trust Liberal promises. This Prime Minister is not worth the cost. The Minister promised the Commission would have complete access to the evidence. And yet, they haven't given the government what the government promised. In fact, the government did the exact opposite and is trying to cover up everything. When will the Liberals finally quit with the cover-up and tell the Canadians the truth?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, I'm curious what point percentage system the member opposite operates off of for repeating Conservative slogans in one question. Perhaps if the member opposite actually looked into the process on the inquiry instead of rehearsing and practicing slogans, he would know that his own House Leader signed off on the process, which included some redactions for client solicitor privilege and cabinet confidence. Mr. Speaker, they should spend more time on understanding interference and less time acting.
The Honourable Member for Lanark, Frontenac, Kingston.
Mr. Speaker, pulmonary arterial hypertension, also known as PAH, is a disease that blocks arteries in the lungs, causing high blood pressure in the lungs and damaging heart tissue. Patients diagnosed with PAH have on average 3 years to live. In the United States, a drug called sotatercept was recently approved by the FDA. This drug increases quality of life and increased lifespan for PAH patients, and even in some cases reverses the damage caused by the disease. Mr. Speaker, when will this life-saving drug be approved for use in Canada?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Health.
Well, thank you very much, Speaker, and I want to thank the member opposite for a very thoughtful question. Of course, our number one priority is to protect Canadians, to make sure that they have all the necessary medications available to them. That's why we're actually bringing a pharmacare legislation by Bill C-64, and I really hope the member opposite will support that bill, because it's going to allow for Canadians to have access to, initially, diabetes and contraceptives. As in relation to the particular medication the member speaking of, I look forward to looking into it, working with him so that I can give him a more precise answer on the approval process for that particular medication.
The Honourable Member for Melpeck.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Parliamentary Secretary to Agriculture and Agri-Food. Mr. Speaker, the Conservative Party continues to delay Bill 234. I'm wondering if the Parliamentary Secretary to Agri-Food and Agriculture can give us an update. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Agriculture.
Mr. Speaker, a month ago I rose in this place and I talked about the Conservative delay on 234, a bill that they've been championing. Again this week we found out they delayed it 2 weeks forward again to play politics on the farmers' back. On this side of the House, we act. On this side of the House, we support farmers and we're proud of farmers. What we don't do is play politics on their backs.
Yeah. The Honourable Member for Timmins, James Bay.
Mushkegowuk Cree region is ground zero for underfunded and systemically racist federal health policy. Yet through it all, the Winnebago Health Authority has worked hard to establish quality health care and proper facilities. And yet at the 11th hour, the Minister of Indigenous Services walked away on her commitment to build a proper hospital. On Monday, national, regional, provincial leaders on health and Indigenous rights will be coming to Ottawa to hold this government to account. They want to know, why did the minister break her word to the people of James Bay?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Indigenous Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And for years, we've been working with WAHA and the communities it serves to shape the future of healthcare delivery. Conversations are ongoing with all partners, as every level of government has a role to play to ensure healthcare for remote communities. From Toronto to Kenora to Moosonee, everyone deserves quality healthcare regardless of who or where they are. We will keep working with Ontario and with WAHA to find a path forward. Thank you.
And the Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise on a very painful, difficult point, and one of which the government is aware. A Canadian citizen, a much-loved member of Fredericton's community, Frederick Moanangabo, has been in hands of brutal kidnappers in Goma, in Congo, since mid-December 2023, 5 long months. Freddie is a much-loved member of the Fredericton community, a human rights advocate, a human rights activist, and his family wants him home. Can the government give us any update as to what is being done to get him out of the hands of murderers and thieves and criminals and get him home?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the Honourable Member for her continued advocacy on this case. We're aware of reports that a Canadian citizen was kidnapped in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We're in contact with the family, and I have met with the family. Kidnappings are an extremely sensitive matter given the risk to a kidnapped victim's life. Due to safety and privacy reasons, no further information can be disclosed on this specific case. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
And that's all the time we have for question period today. Have a great weekend, folks. Daily routine of business, affaires courantes ordinaires, tabling of documents. Dépôt de projet de loi émanant du
Introduction of government bills.
Déclaration.
Statements by ministers.
Rapport de
Reports from interparliamentary delegations.
Presenting reports from committees. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the President of the King's Privy Council.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pursuant to Standing Order 104 and 114, I have the honour to present in both official languages the 66th report of the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs regarding the membership of the Committee of the House. And if the House gives consent, I intend to move concurrence in the 66th report later this day.
Introduction of private members' bills. Première lecture du projet de...
First reading of Senate public bills. Motions. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the President of the Treasury Board.
I move that the 66th report of the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs presented to the House earlier this day be concurred in.
All those opposed to the honourable member moving the motion will please say nay. Agreed. The House has heard the terms of the motion. All those opposed to the motion will please say nay. Motion is carried. Presenting of petitions. Présentation de pétition. The honourable member for... there's just so many. Langley Aldergrove.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to present a petition signed by over 800 people, primarily in my home province of British Columbia, but actually right across Canada, who are concerned that since 2014, violent crime has increased by 38% and gangland-related homicides increased by 126%. They're concerned about lack of regulations concerning use of drugs in public places, and about repeat offenders and catch and release policies. And they're calling on the government to implement regulations and laws to protect the citizens and to reverse soften crime, catch and relief policies. Thank you.
Petitions, présentation pétition. The honourable member for South Okanagan, West Kootenay.
I rise here today to present a petition signed by 84 constituents who draw the attention of the government to the fact that continued assaults on Palestine have escalated to the degree that the actions of Israel has been designated a genocide, and therefore they strongly urge the government of Canada to work with the United Nations, Palestine, and Israel to establish a permanent state of Palestine with the same rights as any other nation, and also to call for immediate substantive humanitarian aid overseen by the United Nations, the Red Cross, and the Red Crescent that will ensure the safety and well-being of all Palestinians in Gaza, the West Bank, and Israel.
Presenting petitions, présentation pétition, the honourable member for Sandwich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to present petitions signed by members of the constituency of Sandwich Gulf Islands deeply concerned about Canadian companies whose actions overseas don't reflect our values or our respect for human rights. They've pointed out in this petition that there are companies based in Canada that contribute to human rights abuses around the world and environmental damage, and that those who protest those Canadian companies and their operations are also harassed and attacked and killed, including Indigenous peoples disproportionately. They call on the Government of Canada and this House of Commons to require companies based in Canada to prevent human rights abuses, to protect the environment globally, and to ensure a legal right for people who have been harmed overseas to seek justice in Canadian courts. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Presenting petitions, présentation pétition, the member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to present a petition in which petitioners are calling on Parliament to pass Bill S-281, known as Brian's Bill, named in honor of Brian Alisic, who was brutally murdered at the University of Alberta. The petitioners are calling for this bill to be passed, a bill that seeks to amend the Corrections and Conditional Release Act such that convicted murderers not be eligible to apply for parole year after serving their minimum sentence. Rather, they would only be eligible for a parole hearing at the time of their automatic review so that victims' families aren't re-traumatized again and again and again.
Presenting petitions, the honourable for Cowichan, Malahat, Langford.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud to rise in the House today to present e-petition 4919, which was initiated by Chris Tucker, the president of Port Renfrew's Chamber of Commerce in my riding of Cowichan and Malahat-Langford. The petitioners want the government to recognize that closing the recreational fishery endangers Port Renfrew's economy, threatening over 100 small business owners' livelihoods, that no supporting data for the efficacy of static closures has been provided by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, while many communities' economies face severe impacts, that critical threats to the southern resident killer whales, such as pollution and large shipping vessel traffic, remain under-addressed compared to the focus on recreational fishing, that Port Renfrew's significant economic contribution, backed by a community and the Pachidat First Nation, underscores the need for sensible conservation efforts, that advocating for a shift from arbitrary, punitive regulations to informed, evidence-based policies that ensure southern resident killer whale protection without compromising small communities' economic stability and future planning. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, the petitioners call upon the Government of Canada to adopt science-based regulations that recognize the marginal impact of recreational fishery on the southern resident killer whales, do not require closures to recreational fishing, and supports a conservation-minded approach. What they want, Mr. Speaker, is thriving orcas, thriving oceans, and thriving communities for many generations to come. Mr. Speaker, I am proud to support the good people of Port Renfrew. Thank you.
Presenting petitions, the honourable member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honour to rise and table 3 petitions today on behalf of the residents of Kelowna Lake Country and Region. I will be very brief. The first petition is calling on the Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship of Canada to make available a specialized permanent residency pathway for Ukrainians currently in Canada under the Canada-Ukraine Authorization for Emergency Travel provisions that do not require them to have a Canadian citizen or permanent resident family member in Canada. The second petition is calling on the Government of Canada to fulfill their promises they made to the Government of Ukraine and the Armed Forces of Ukraine to supply 155mm shells and National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile Systems. The third petition is calling on the Minister of Defense to donate the 83,000 discontinued surplus CRV-7 rockets to the Armed Forces of Ukraine for the use of Ukraine's military defense against Russia's aggressive and illegal war. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Presenting petitions, the honourable for Dauphin Swan River, Neepawa.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's always an honour to present a petition on behalf of constituents. Mr. Speaker, I rise for the 38th time on behalf of the people of Swan River, Manitoba, to present a petition on the rising rate of crime. The people of Swan River are upset that jail is a revolving door for repeat offenders, as Bill C-75 allows violent offenders to be in jail in the morning and back on the street the same day. The Manitoba West District RCMP reported that just 15 individuals were responsible for 1,184 calls for service. The people of Swan River are calling for jail, not bail, for violent repeat offenders. Mr. Speaker, the people of Swan River demand that this Liberal government repeal their soft on-crime policies that directly threaten their livelihoods and their community. I support the good people of Swan River.
Taking up petitions, the honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure that I rise today to table yet another petition in regards to the relationship, in essence, between Canada and India, and how the communities here in Canada are hoping to be able to see more direct flights going from Canada to India. A special emphasis, because the constituents of mine talking about Winnipeg, ideally directly to India or somewhere in Europe as a secondary thing, hoping that whether it's parliamentarians or the industry as a whole is made more aware of that demand. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Présentation de pétition. Questions on the order paper. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The following questions will be answered today, 2503, 2506, and 2508. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, if a revised response to question number 2364, originally tabled on April 10, 2024, and the government's responses to questions numbered 2502, 2504, 2505, and 2506 2007 could be made orders for return, these returns would be tabled in an electronic format immediately.
That the aforementioned questions be made orders for return and that they be tabled immediately. Agreed, and so ordered. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Finally, Mr. Speaker, I would ask that all remaining questions be allowed to stand at this time, please.
To orders of the day, I think the Honourable Member for Dauphin Swan River Neepawa has a point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm rising on a point of order regarding government's response to my written question 2485 that was published on the order paper on March 20th, 2024. In my written response, I asked the government about their consultation process for Parks Canada's detailed impact assessment of management of zebra mussels in Clear Lake in Riding Mountain National Park that was open for public comment in February 2024. When I asked the government, and I quote, "Who did Parks Canada directly inform the detailed impact assessment and when were each of them notified?" End quote. The government stated, and I quote, "Parks Canada informed the following groups of the opportunity to publicly comment on the detailed impact assessment," end quote. Included on the list of organizations that Parks Canada claimed to notify was my office, the Wasagamane Chamber of Commerce, and Clear Lake Country, a local tourism association. This was a concerning response, given that neither my office nor I were informed that Parks Canada initially launched an opportunity to publicly comment on the detailed impact assessment. Furthermore, it has come to my attention that neither Wasagamane Chamber of Commerce nor Clear Lake Country were initially informed of the opportunity to publicly comment on the detailed impact assessment for Clear Lake within Riding Mountain National Park, despite being identified as key stakeholders by Parks Canada. In the response, the government claimed that Damien Wall, the external relations manager for Riding Mountain Field Unit, informed these stakeholders of the initial public comment period on behalf of Parks Canada. However, no records of this exist. This directly contradicts the government's response and indicates that the government provided false information to Parliament. I hope the government will review this response and correct the record at the earliest opportunity. Thank you.
I want to thank the Honourable Member for that point of order. That was the topic of a point of privilege that was brought forward in this chamber not so long ago. At the time, we suggested that the House should decide on either sending this for review or what have you. So again, a decision that the House is going to have to make, but we will look at that a little more closer, see if we can come back with something more concrete. Order du jour.
Orders of the day.
Order du jour,
Government orders. Resuming debate at third reading of Bill C-68, Act to amend Canada Labour Code. Debate, the Honourable Member for Thérèse de Blainville. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in Quebec, in 1977, under René Lévesque's PQ government, the Labour Code prohibited the use of strikebreakers. The Minister of Labour at the time, Pierre-Marc Johnson, when the bill was tabled, had this to say: "The purpose of this is not to automatically close factories at a time of a lockout or legal strike. Rather, it aims to restore a healthy balance between the parties and eliminate practices that are sources of tension and violence during disputes. It's the workers, not the companies, who are the first to suffer from a work stoppage, and allowing the employer to act as if nothing had happened at the time of a lockout or legal strike creates a fundamental imbalance between the parties." This was a major step forward for the rights of Quebec workers. Among other things, it marked the history of the labour movement and its struggles. Today, 46 years later, the purpose of Bill C-58 is to amend the Canada Labour Code to ban replacement workers. Bravo! Or should I say, at last. It's certainly a step forward for the rights of workers under federal jurisdiction, but above all, it's also a step backwards, an inexcusable delay that has hampered and is still hampering and will continue to hamper at least until the bill comes into force, i.e. 12 months after its enactment, the fate of thousands of workers who have lost their fundamental right to negotiate and the right to strike. Quebec workers are under two systems. There's federal jurisdiction, and under federal jurisdiction pay the cost of this injustice. There has been a lockout for almost 2 years at the port where the employer uses replacement workers. No one is talking about it. No one cares because things keep operating. It's unacceptable. Also, the employees of Videotron in Gatineau. There's thousands of jobs being transferred to call centers outside of the country. And now these workers have been on strike for several months now. And they are using replacement workers. At the port of Sorel Tracy, they're also on strike. They have been for 12 months. Metal workers also have been called in to replace to use anti-scabs. Employers have acted in full impunity because they know the Canada Labour Code, and to date has not been amended. Strike anti-scab legislation has been requested for quite some time by unions, as has the Bloc. In 33 years and 11 bills, including the very first bill introduced in 1990 by the Dean of this chamber, the member for Bécancour, Nicolas Sorel, the Liberals and the Conservatives have taken their turn blocking our bills. During the same Parliament, I tabled Bill C-276 in May of 2022. Union groups and the Bloc have led this fight repeatedly with the strength of our convictions. The NDP will take the credit. It was also part of the struggle, and we can indeed thank them for their work, as well as that of the Minister of Labour and the leadership for the leadership he has shown. But, because there is a but, a really big but, in fact, because unfortunately we have to ask about the way the bill has been concocted, with, among other things, the proposed implementation deadline. Do they really have the intention to have this bill see the light, or is it just window dressing for things to look good? Mr. Speaker, you know as well as I do that there's a clear difference between appearances and reality, just like there's a difference between the virtues we signal and the values we practice. Finally, from the outset, the Bloc has been critical of the fact that the initial bill provided for an 18-month delay before coming into force after royal assent. When you calculate this delay in the presence of a minority government, you're entitled to at least question what the intent is. We tabled an amendment in committee to get rid of this delay, proposing that the bill take effect as soon as it receives royal assent. This amendment was defeated by all parties. The NDP and the Liberals agreed in advance to propose 12 months. Shameful. However, the vast majority of the unions we heard from said that it was hard to explain this delay, and they also proposed that the bill take effect as soon as it was received royal assent. If they want to protect workers, the Bloc always shows up. And as soon as the bill was tabled, we announced that we also wanted to improve it at committee and quickly close this loophole so that the nonsense of using scabs could be banished forever. We proposed amendments wisely put forward by the unions aimed at, among other things, including federal public service employees. What a big omission, Mr. Speaker. The government's legislation, as an employer, will not target its own employees. So we raised an amendment about this that was deemed not deemed receivable, but on principle, this is shameful that this legislation does not cover the government's own federal employees. This is an error that needs to be rectified. Also, we tried to bring forth amendments to modify or repeal articles that provided for exceptions to the prohibition rule. It may seem complicated. We're banning scab workers, but there are some exceptions to this rule. For example, I know full well that the employer, in case of a conflict, can use different employees. An employee from a bargaining unit from the same employer, but not in a same unit, from another bargaining unit hired before the start of negotiations to perform work normally carried out by a striking worker could be used. That doesn't make any sense. The unions have justly criticized this. It doesn't make sense under the law how some categories can be excluded, such as contractors, dependent contractors. How could they be excluded from this ban? In Quebec, this would be banned. So we need to provide for an investigation mechanism. In Quebec, we have provided for this. If we want to sanction employers and be more severe, we need to allow the Commission to do its work to investigate if the employer does not respect the law, if we have to be able to call an investigator. But this amendment was also defeated. We also want to reduce the time limits for labor relation board orders to not unduly hamper recourse to the right to strike. Sorry, I was distracted there. So, unfortunately, all of these amendment proposals were defeated. We also tried to propose improvements, which were not accepted. They were essential to the consistency of this bill's purpose, which aimed to fully recognize the fundamental right of free negotiation and the right to strike. But we can be proud to have supported them, to have lived up to our convictions, and to have listened to and supported the demands of the unions and the struggle of workers to defend their rights. We probably won't see such an exercise again in the near future. So this bill warranted more careful examination and attention to meet its purposes. And I hope history will give workers the treatment they deserve after all the suffering they have experienced over so many years. Thank you. Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Victoria. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank my colleague for her speech. For some time, the Bloc has had a similar position to ours, so thank you for this support for workers. Can the member talk to us about the impact that this bill would have for people? The Honourable Member for Thérèse de Blainville. As you must know, having a bill that is so robust is intended mainly to make sure that workers under federal jurisdiction can count on free bargaining rights and the right to strike. This also allows bans on the use of scab workers. It'll also allow for conflict periods to be shorter. When I'm talking about what's happening at the Port of Quebec, it's serious. We're talking about Quebec workers under a federal jurisdiction that are currently in a lockout by their employer. They have been so for 2 years, and no one cares about them because the employer uses scab workers, and this would be a major change for them. We always have to bear in mind that the right to strike and the right to bargaining are fundamental rights protected by the Charter. So normally, the Liberals should be in favor of these rights being respected. This legislation will change everything, but it should have changed before. Questions and comments? The Honourable Government House Leader. Parliamentary Secretary, sorry. Thank you.
You know, when I think of the legislation and the potential impact that it has, we can talk about those that are within federal responsibility, but I like to think that we've had the province of Quebec that the member made reference to and having anti-scab legislation for many years now. So has the province of British Columbia. And I really do believe that by the national government now bringing forward this legislation, and getting the support of all political entities inside the chamber, it would appear, in terms of its passage, sends a very powerful message. And ultimately, I think that it could influence other provincial legislatures to do likewise and bring in anti-scab legislation. I wonder if she can provide her thoughts on that issue.
The Honourable Member for Thérèse de Blainville. Every province has its own jurisdiction, Mr. Speaker, and every province can decide what social progress it would like to make in terms of labour law. In Quebec, we have this. 46 years later, Mr. Speaker, 46 years later, the federal government is now saying that it's happy with what's happening. It would even be happier if the federal government said for its own federal employees under federal jurisdiction that they would at least have the courage to include the public service employees and to ensure that this bill comes into force right now as soon as it receives royal assent, to not let this situation continue any further. And the use of scab workers. There's still to be work to be done here. Thank you. Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Repentigny. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. First, I'd like to congratulate my colleague for her speech. In terms of labour law, she is unbeatable in this House. But when we had the first debates on this, many Bloc members questioned the government to know why there was this famous 18-month delay in coming into force after royal assent. And then they said, work at committee, we'll look at this. But then they worked to reduce this period from 18 to 12 months. But does my colleague know why? Why, unlike with all other legislation that receives royal assent, that come into force right away, this particular bill will take 12 months. At committee, did they find any interesting answers to this, or intelligent answers to why there is such a deadline? The Honourable Member for Thérèse de Blainville. Well, you asked if there were any intelligence answers. I'm not accusing anyone of not being intelligent, but I asked the minister questions regularly, and I was told that the Industrial Relations Committee needed time to ensure that legislation would be fully enforced. So, well, I don't want to cast any shade on this answer, but when you work on the time between a bill is crafted and when it comes into force, we could imagine that the government could have harnessed all of the necessary resource to have the work start right away. So, Mr. Speaker, there's a big difference between tabling a bill and hoping to see it implemented. Thank you. Questions and comments?
The honourable member for Pierre Boucher, Les Patriotes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to congratulate my colleague on her work. My colleague, in her speech, set the stage and explained why there's a lack of political will to see this bill through. So, in 1977, the government of Quebec solved this problem. So that's 50 years ago, once and for all. And so there have been efforts to bring the federal government up to speed. My colleague, the lean of this House, Mr. Plamondon, back then in 77, I was still in diapers. So my question for my colleague is, how is it that it's taken so long? Why are we still talking about this? Why hasn't it happened, and why is there still a danger that it still won't happen? Before giving the floor to the member for Thérèse de Blainville, I'd like to remind the member that you're not allowed to name members by their name in this place. You have to name them by their riding name or by their title. And now the answer to the honourable member for Thérèse de Blainville. Just a short answer. There may be multiple reasons, but it takes political will ultimately. On both sides of the House, after this many years, people are just having to make do in the labor world. This government has introduced multiple pieces of legislation that undermined worker rights. So it really, ultimately, the answer is it takes political will to change the ground rules. Will this be the time that it gets done? Who knows? Because there are workers on strike or on lockout, and they know full well that even this bill will not come into force in time to help them out. So it'll just be for future situations, and maybe that'll be in 12 months after royal assent at the earliest, before this ever comes into force, if it ever does. We have time for a brief question, a quick question and answer. There's time for one last one. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Briefly, Mr. Speaker, if the member can just amplify the other social benefits that workers, in particular unionized workers, have brought to our country, province of Quebec and so forth, through the advocacy of good, solid social programs.
The Honourable Member for Thérèse de Blainville in 45 seconds. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to say thank you for the question, but I hope you know the answer. The union movement, since the very beginning, has made progress not only on worker rights, but also has helped society progress in many ways with social justice, more equality, more equity. They did this, the unions did this not just for workers, but for every member of the public or of society. And in Quebec, they have marked our evolution ever since the Quiet Revolution, where the socio-political context was quite different and the conflicts were bitter, they were tough. And so the unions have contributed to the evolution of society. And unfortunately, I have to interrupt the Honourable Member for Thérèse de Blainville. Her time is up. Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Timmins, James Bay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Get unanimous consent to split my time with the member for Burnaby South.
Is there unanimous consent for this motion? Agreed and carried. The Honourable Member for Timmins, James Bay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Today is a powerful day. A day that I actually never thought I would see in the House of Commons after 8 efforts over the years in my time to bring forward legislation to protect workers from anti-scab actions by employers to deny them their fundamental rights. And yet we are here today to bring this into law. On my way here, I learned that the International Criminal Court has now called, or the International Court of Justice today has called out Israel for their the brutal genocide that is happening in Gaza and Rafah, and called on them to end this horrific campaign. This is a day of justice. And I think of Martin Luther King's beautiful statement that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And that slogan's been used many, many, many times over the years. But what people don't often reflect on is that the bending of that arc of justice is done in the face of immense opposition. It is done in the face of threat. It is done in the face of harassment, and it is often done in the face of violence. But the arc of the moral universe will move inevitably towards justice. And I was thinking that, Mr. Speaker, because my mom called me last night. My mom is a hard rock miner's daughter. In fact, her father, Joe McNeil, started in the Cape Breton coal mines back when Dominion Steel used to use the army against the coal miners in New Waterford and Glace Bay. And what they had a classic tactic. They would make the men and families sleep in the winter in tents to break them. And they called them communists, and they called them radicals, and they called them extremists. There was nothing radical or extreme about fighting for a living wage. What was radical and extreme were the capitalists who would use the army and put a machine gun in the church steeple in New Waterford to try and intimidate working people. But that moral universe, the arc, bent relentlessly towards justice, because there's a moment when you just can't put up with it anymore, and you won't put up with it anymore. So yes, my mom called me last night, and my mom said to me how inspired she is, because these are dark times. But my mom always sees hope. And she said to me, I was so inspired to see the young people marching out of those university commencements. University students who are putting their careers on the line in the United States, facing serious harassment, being called all kinds of hateful things by an establishment that wants to shut them down. And my mom said, young people get it. They're not going to sit silent in the face of a genocide. Because again, what bends towards justice is bending in the face of the harassment and the intimidation and the false threats that these young students are somehow extremists and radicals. There is nothing extreme about speaking up against the mass killing of children. What is extreme is going along with it. Like last night, when the International Criminal Court has called for indictments against Benjamin Netanyahu for war crimes, that this government and its key ministers would be drinking wine and schnapps with Israeli leaders here in Ottawa. Now we can say, yes, we're friends. We are. Canada has a long, deep friendship with Israel. But friends don't let friends commit war crimes. And so my mom said, I was so inspired by these young people who were standing up and walking out and marching in the streets. And my mother said to me, I'm going to get my walker and I'm going to go down and walk with them. My mother has never been to a demonstration in her life, but she sees the mark of the oral.
We have a point of order from the honourable member.
If this is relevant to the bill that we're actually discussing.
We'll remind everyone about I can't even say the word. The honourable member for Timmins, James Bay.
Thank you. I invite the honourable member to come talk to my mom. She'd give him a few lessons in moral justice. That's right. And the reason I'm talking about my mom is a hard rock miner's daughter. And my mom taught me My mom always said, son, do the right thing throughout your life. And you know, my dad said, never cross a picket line. That was the family that we grew up in. So when my mom calls me about justice, I listen, and I think the honourable member should listen about justice too, because my mom is not an extremist. My mom stands up for what is right. And we're all called to stand up for what is right. Which brings us to this bill. For year in, year out, workers have had to fight for their basic right to be recognized. That if they are facing injustice, poor pay, they have a right to withdraw their labor. And nobody ever gave the union movement or the labor movement anything in this country, certainly not any conservative who's ever lived. That's right. You know, I think of, in my community, the fight for the 8-hour day was won at the Conneagus mine in 1914. And the miners who went on strike at the Conneagus knew what the consequences were. The consequences were that half that workforce was fired and their families were evicted from their homes. None of those men were radicals or extremists like the conservatives of the time called them, but they had reached a point where they were not going to put up with the brutal conditions underground anymore. And they knew what the odds were. They knew that if they stood up, many of them would be thrown out on the street, their families not able to be fed, but they did it for the bigger vision, the bigger right, which is that the arc of the moral universe may be long, and it may take a long time, but it bends inevitably towards justice. I think of all the strikes and labor battles that we've seen in the North, and some of them have been brutal, and there are stories that are told in our region. The 1958 Inco strike, which one of my old-timer friends, Mike Farrell, told me was the mine mill Stalingrad. Families lost everything in that fight. They lost homes. They lost their cars. They lost their marriages. And when I was walking with the copper and nickel miners in 2010 against the Valley strike, their grandchildren told me, my grandfather and my grandmother were in that 58 strike, and I'm here today to live up to that obligation. Because that the arc of the moral universe, it bends towards justice because people know what is right. And what we see, you know, and I see it from conservatives who tell me, you shouldn't speak up about international things, just talk about what's at home. That's not the Canadian way. You shouldn't get involved in something that has nothing to do with you. That's not the Canadian way. The Canadian way is we bend towards justice because it is the right thing. So we are at this moment in Parliament where we may finally pass anti-scab. And I have to say, I have my suspicions, you know, if a conservative government comes in, do you actually think they'll ever defend workers? Not a chance. No. Not a chance. Never. But we're going to see them stand up, and whether or not they stand for the right thing or not. Because this is a moment. And, you know, I was talking about the strikes in the North. There is nothing more bitter than when you bring in scabs to tell a family that we are going to starve you out. That we're going to bust them in, and we're going to use the cops, and we're going to use the state to beat you down and take away that one right that you have as a worker, the right to either supply your employment or take it away if you're not being treated with justice. And we've had many, many of these horrific battles, and it was mentioned earlier that Peggy Whitty, one of the most horrible corporate leaders ever, who was lionized by the Canadian mining industry that led to the 9 men being killed in Giant Yellowknife Mine. Well, what they also don't tell you about what Peggy Whitty did was that she robbed the pensions of workers from my region at Pamour Mine, and she got away with it. We have to have laws that protect workers and protect them in strikes so that they can engage fairly. And so on this day, when we are here at the final moment to maybe get past the finish line with anti-scab, while the international community is now calling out the genocide in Gaza, we have to think how powerful it is to be at this moment. Because, yeah, the struggle is long, the struggle is hard, the struggle doesn't end easy, but we have to always bend that power towards justice and fairness and the right of the individual, whether in their union or whether as a civil human being to live in dignity. That's what we're here for. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Councillor Kamal Tar, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, Government House Leader.
Yes, so thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I've had the opportunity to speak to the legislation earlier, and one of the things that I like to amplify is the fact that, the federal legislation is fantastic. We're glad to see it. Hopefully it will get the support of every member in the House. But what I'm thinking in terms of is the impact in the rest of the country in terms of, let's say, other provincial legislatures, where we have British Columbia, Quebec, that already have anti-scab legislation, and the potential message that it sends to other provinces and the territories in terms of having anti-scab legislation is okay. We don't need to be fearful of it. And I'm wondering if he could provide his thoughts in regards to the potential impact of this legislation having influence at the provincial jurisdictions where more workers would actually benefit by having anti-scab legislation.
Member for Timmins James Bay.
Thank you. It is really important that we see at the federal government level that commitment to the worker right to withdraw their wages and not have to deal with the private security companies, the scab buses coming in, the violence that ends up on the picket lines. And I've seen this in the mining communities I represent, the abuse of worker rights. When we establish a norm, and it shows that it will bring both sides back to the table quicker. When you can't starve out your opponent, when you haven't stockpiled, a year's worth of nickel and decide I'm going to use scab labor and we're going to starve you out. That destroys not just the relationship, but it destroys in the long term communities because people leave and people don't put up with it. This is a good way to settle this.
Question commentaire, l'honorable député Pierre Boucher.
The honourable member for Pierre Boucher. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to congratulate the member for Timmins, James Bay, on his excellent speech. I think it was one of the most inspiring speeches we've ever heard in defense of worker rights, and I think the member's always been there to defend the worker, and I'm happy to hear it. But the Bloc at committee tabled an amendment so that instead of it taking a year for this bill to enter into force, it would enter into force immediately. My colleague in his speech talked about people who don't get any wages when they're on strike and they have trouble paying their mortgages and so on, and their rent during that time, and they get replaced by scabs and so on. So my question is, where was all this nice rhetoric before at committee? The honourable member. I'd like to thank the member for that good question. It's clear to me that I'm concerned about the delay before this bill would enter into force. It's a real problem for workers, all across Canada, particularly with if there is a Conservative government next. This Liberal government should keep its commitment to implement this bill now for workers in Canada.
Pat Langford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was reflecting on my colleague's use of the term arc, and that arc does not bend on its own. In many cases, we have to force it to bend. And while I can take pride as a New Democrat today in the House of Commons for having brought the House of Commons to this moment, I recognize that this effort and the many efforts of NDP MPs over the years, we did not arrive at this moment alone. It was the labor movement that fought for this change. They were the agitators, the people who forced MPs to arrive at this moment. Through you, Mr. Speaker, can my colleague just reflect on that incredible activism of the labor movement that brought to the House of Commons to where it is today?
The honourable member for Timmins James Bay, 45 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I will share with my colleague when I was in his region on Vancouver Island, and I visited a graveyard that had been desecrated. The Japanese families who worked in the mines, whose graves were desecrated in the Second World War, and there was a plaque on the wall that they had rebuilt the graveyard as best they could, and the plaque was from the nickel and copper miners, Mine Mill Local 598 of Sudbury, who told their workers, they had heard about what had happened to the Japanese, and they raised money in the 1950s so that people in Vancouver Island would know that their comrades were there. That is the arc of justice. It bends because people stand up and say they're going to make it bend, and that's what we're here to do today.
Continuing debate, the honourable member for Burnaby South.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. And I got to say, I'm really honored to be able to follow after my colleague and dear friend, the member from Timmins James Bay. This is a really special occasion. I want to talk a bit about where I'm speaking to you today. I'm actually speaking to you today from the Union Centre in Winnipeg after having just met with the Manitoba Federation of Labour. And what's so poignant about that?
I have a point of order from the honourable member. I have an honourable Charles Wood St. James and Assiniboia Heading Link.
Clearly has a prop in the view right behind him. If you want, next time I speak, I'll bring him in a big poster that says the message I want to say and put it right up here behind me. He's got to be called out of order, and he can't speak until he moves.
Yeah. The honourable member for New Westminster Burnaby.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. You've already ruled on this in the past. We've had MPs speaking from a variety of areas. I would ask you, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that Conservative MPs respect this speech and respect the bill. If they are in favour of anti-scab legislation, there should be no problem with them allowing the speech to continue. It is absolutely appropriate, as you've ruled in the past, Mr. Speaker.
All right. Well, while I appreciate there's been a number of occasions in the House, especially during the time that we were doing a lot of online, that we ruled on not having props in the background, not having words in the background, in some cases not having flags in the background. So maybe what I can ask if we can maybe get rid of the wording in the background, or just perfect. There you go. When we ask, it shall be done. The honourable member for Burnaby South.
Mr. Speaker, I noticed that the Conservatives are upset because I was going to reference the Winnipeg strike, actually, and these are pictures about the Winnipeg strike behind me, and they actually capture the story even better than the words. But I want to talk about why it's so important, and maybe this is why the Conservatives are upset, because they don't like when the power of workers come together to fight back and defend working people. But what happened in 1919, in the very same time we find ourselves in right now, from mid-May to late June of 1919, 30,000 workers, basically the entire working force of Winnipeg, and in a lot of ways all of Manitoba at the time, came together and shut down the city and effectively shut down the province, fighting for fairness for workers. They were protesting the unfair work conditions, the poverty, and specifically issues like collective bargaining. And it is so poignant that I am here in Winnipeg at the Union Centre, having just spoken with the Manitoba Federation of Labour and their president, Kevin Rebeck, and I want to thank him for all his hard work and the MFL for all their hard work. But it's so poignant, I think, speaking to this bill today in this place from this spot. And I have to say what an honor it is that today our Bill C-58 that we fought for, will ban scabs once and for all at the federal level. This is a historic result of the hard work of New Democrats. And I have to say this would not have happened but for New Democrats forcing this government to do this. And I also have to acknowledge that this would not have happened but for Labour and for unions who have long led the charge for anti-scab legislation. And I want to thank them. I also have to acknowledge that this is an accomplishment that we have achieved, that we are debating this right now in the House, that the Manitoba NDP are also going to move forward with. And I want to salute and acknowledge that. But I have to say, this has been a long time coming. New Democrats have been fighting for decades for this to happen. In the past 15 years, New Democrats have tabled anti-scab legislation 8 times. 8 times, where unions, Labour, and New Democrats have fought for this. The last time it came for vote in 2016, the Liberals and Conservatives teamed up to vote against it. The leader of the Conservatives voted against banning scabs 8 times in the past. So it's clear whose side they stand on. But with the supporting guidance of our Labour allies, with union leaders and activists, we have finally secured this moment. This legislation is about giving more power to workers. It's about giving power to workers so they can negotiate a fair deal and so we can ban scabs once and for all. And let's talk about what that means. Banning scabs is about giving more power to workers and less power to the big bosses and to CEOs. It's about ensuring that when a worker makes that difficult decision to go on strike, that their jobs aren't stolen by scabs. That's what this is about. Bannir les scabs au niveau fédéral, c'est
Banning scabs at the federal level is historic. Quebec was ahead of the curve on this and did so at the provincial level in Quebec. This bill, championed by my colleague, the member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie, takes inspiration from Quebec's legislation. But this bill goes even further because now many Quebecers working under federally regulated workplaces will have stronger rights. And that's not thanks to the Liberals, the Conservatives, or the Bloc Québécois. It's thanks to the NDP. If the NDP was government, the legislation would be even stronger. But we had to work with Liberals. Liberals, throughout this process, have sided with employers, but the NDP has always sided with workers. I'm proud of the NDP. This is a historic moment. Banning replacement workers will give more power to workers, less power to CEOs. Workers will have more bargaining power to negotiate better salaries. And in times of high inflation, this is exactly what workers need.
Workers get the respect they deserve. That's what's needed now more than ever, because we know times are tough. We know that workers are getting gouged by corporate greed at the grocery stores, corporate greed when it comes to corporate landlords jacking up rents, and corporate greed in telcos who charge Canadians some of the highest fees in the world for their cell phones and internet services. But workers are fighting back. We are seeing workers organizing across this country. We're seeing it recently in Starbucks and Amazon. We're seeing it in the public and private sector. Unions are on the front line of fighting inflation because that's what unions do. They fight for working people. And New Democrats as well. This anti-scab legislation is one additional tool to protect workers from getting ripped off and exploited by big bosses. But I want to acknowledge that this isn't the only thing New Democrats have fought for. Specifically for workers, we have forced the federal government to bring in 2 additional measures already. We have made it the law of the land in Canada that federal regulated workers will get 10 paid days of sick leave. That was never the law before. We made that happen. We also forced this government to bring in a Sustainable Jobs Act that ensures that workers have a seat at the table by law. And that anytime we discuss the future of jobs in our country, that we talk about training opportunities for workers that go through unions, that we create good union jobs with good wages as we look towards a net zero economy. That's what we established with the Sustainable Jobs Act. Again, something the Conservatives tried to fight against it every step of the way. Speaking of fighting every step of the way, I want to be very clear. When I say New Democrats made this happen, it's because we had to force the Liberals, we had to force the Prime Minister to act. We know that the Prime Minister and the Liberal Party voted against anti-scab legislation just a few years ago. Without unions and without the New Democrats, nothing happens. None of this happens. New Democrats had to force the Prime Minister to bring in this legislation after decades. And even then, after forcing them to bring it in, they missed the mark. We had to fight to strengthen the legislation for workers with amendments. And earlier this month, we amended the bill to speed up the implementation from 18 months to 12 months. Workers will be protected sooner because of that. We also made sure that we closed loopholes to prevent any attempts of employers from skirting these laws. We also specifically made sure that workers will not be exploited by employers who try to use employees from another workplace or use students or volunteers as scab workers. This is about ensuring employees can strike for better wages without their bargaining rights being threatened. Big bosses will have to now show up in good faith for bargaining at the bargaining table and to negotiate in a manner of good faith. But imagine what we could have done if the out-of-touch Liberals were not in the way. Strong anti-scab legislation would already have been in place. Corporate greed and big bosses would be in check. But I also want to talk about the serious risk presented by the leader of the Conservatives. The leader of the Conservatives likes to cosplay that he's there for working people. But we all know that what the leader of the Conservatives and the Conservative parties want to do is wage a war against unions, a war against workers, in direct contrast to what this bill is all about. The leader of the Conservative Party would bring back anti-union legislation, as he did when he was in cabinet with the Harper government. He would bring in laws to make it harder for workers to fight for better deals. In 2013, the leader of the Conservative Party said very boldly, and I quote, "I am the first federal politician to make a dedicated push towards bringing..."
I have to apologize to the honourable member, but the 10 minutes has gone by in a flash. Maybe he'll have an opportunity to finish his speech in maybe some response to some of the questions. Questions and comments? The honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate where it is that the leader of the New Democratic Party is. In fact, if he goes a little bit further down Main Street, you'll see that we have the iconic image of the streetcar sculpture, which is a very significant icon, not only for Winnipeg, but I would suggest to you for all of Canada, because of what the meaning behind the streetcar and the 1919 general strike. And it's really ironic in the sense that you have today the anti-replacement legislation or anti-scab legislation, and that cart, that streetcar, was perceived coming in as replacement workers, Mr. Speaker. So I thought I really did appreciate the background. Having said that, I'm wondering if the leader could provide his thoughts in regards to, with the federal legislation that we're having today, and it looks like we'll get all party support in passing the legislation, if not today, possibly Monday. Whenever it happens, it happens. The question is, does he agree with me that it sends a very encouraging messages to other jurisdictions? And hopefully, for example, the province of Manitoba will quickly have anti-scab legislation on the books too.
The honourable member for Burnaby South.
Thanks for the question. I had always hoped, and I know labor leaders and union leaders had always hoped, that establishing anti-scab legislation at the federal level would be used as a tool to inspire and to inform other provincial jurisdictions to bring in similar legislation. Ultimately, for New Democrats, for union leaders, for labor leaders, the goal is to ensure that nowhere in our country, at no jurisdiction, at no level, will workers ever be threatened by scabs stealing their jobs. And that's ultimately the goal of New Democrats. We want to make it very clear. We want workers to be able to negotiate fair deals. And if they choose to have to go on strike to fight for those fairness and fight for fair wages, they do so without the threat of a scab stealing their job. And that's what I hope to achieve with this bill, and what we all, as New Democrats, hope to achieve, and what the labor movement hopes to achieve, is inspiration to inspire other provincial jurisdictions to bring it in. But with Manitoba, rest assured, there's already a strong commitment from the Premier of Manitoba to bring in anti-scab legislation. They've already tabled it, and they will be moving forward.
Questions and comments? Questions, commentaires? L'honorable député de Repentigny.
The honourable member for Repentigny. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for Burnaby South for his speech. He didn't seem to give much credit to the Bloc Québécois, though. There are gaps in the bill. For instance, federal public servants are not among the workers who will be covered by this legislation. There's another aspect that I would like to highlight, which is the fact that this bill will only come into effect 12 months after royal assent. In committee, the Bloc Québécois moved an amendment that the bill come into force and be effective immediately after royal assent. So can the member for Burnaby South explain to us how this 12-month delay can be considered reasonable, given that there's a minority government and the bill could not end up being implemented? The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party. Thank you for the question. We're in this situation that we're in now thanks to the NDP. We would not have anti-scab legislation if it hadn't been for the NDP putting pressure on the government. And it's also because of the NDP Liberal agreement, Without the NDP, there wouldn't have been this pressure to move forward with this legislation. Unions have also worked very hard for this legislation, and we're grateful for their help. As for the implementation timeline, we brought it down from 18 months. The Liberals wanted it to be an 18-month implementation delay, and we brought that down to 12 months. We need to be very clear about the fact that without the NDP putting pressure on the government, this legislation never would have been tabled, and we wouldn't be debating it now. It is thanks to the NDP that workers in Quebec and elsewhere in Canada who work in federally regulated workplaces will have these protections and rights.
Powerful paychecks come from powerful unions, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to be a New Democrat today, and I thank the leader of the Democratic Party for their consistent efforts in making what we know was possible reality. 15 years New Democrats have tabled this piece of legislation. 8 times have we seen the Liberals and Conservatives join forces to make certain workers aren't more powerful. This is a remarkable day for workers. I thank workers. I thank all my colleagues of the New Democratic Party for this work. But I'm nervous and I'm scared that we could possibly see a Conservative government try to roll back some of these protections, try to put workers back to work like they often do by back-to-work legislation when they join forces with Liberals. Can the members speak to how important it is to have powerful unions?
I like it when I say short questions, and here we go for a short answer. The Honourable Leader of the NDP.
Well, I got to thank my colleague for that question. A great question. And he's right to be worried. We saw that the Conservatives have voted against back-to-work legislation in the past. The leader voted against it 8 times in the past. He's in favor of back-to-work legislation. He's opposed anti-SCAP legislation. He's fought car check legislation. He's voted against the minimum wage, not once, but twice. He vowed to cut workers' pensions and to slash employment insurance to save $500 million for CEOs, but leaving workers out to dry. So we know this is a legitimate concern. We believe very strongly, not only do we need to have this legislation, we need to ensure that there's anti-SCAP legislation that's in place, but we also need to be very clear that strong unions have to be supported so they can fight for good wages for workers. The only way workers get fairness is with strong unions. So let us be very clear, New Democrats are the only labor party at the federal level. We are proudly founded by unions and will always defend unions' ability to fight for workers to ensure they get fair wages and fair work conditions.
Resuming debate. Seeing none, is the House ready for the question? The question is as follows. Madame Bibeau.
Bibeau, seconded by Mr. Boissonnault.
An act to amend the Canada Labour Code and the Canada Industrial Relations Board regulations. 2012 be now read a third time and do pass. If a member participating in person wishes the motion be carried or carried on division, or if a member of a recognized party participating in person wishes to request a recorded division, I invite them to rise and indicate to the chair. The honourable member for New Westminster Burnaby.
For this historic vote, decades in the making, I would ask for a recorded vote, Mr. Speaker.
Pursuant to Standing Order 45, the division stands deferred until Monday, May 27th, 2024, at the expiry of the time provided for oral questions. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I ask that the daily hour of adjournment of the next sitting be midnight pursuant to standing an order adopted on February 28th, 2024. Moreover, we were unable to reach an agreement under 78.1 or 78.2 standing orders as for the second reading stage of C45, an act to amend the Canada-Newfoundland offshore agreement and the implementation of the Canada-Nova Scotia agreement on offshore oil and gas, and to amend other legislation under the terms of Standing Order 78.3, I give notice that at the next sitting of the House, a minister will move a motion to limit the number of days or hours of debate at this step, pursuant to order made Wednesday, February 28th, 2024. The minister's request to extend the next sitting is deemed adopted.
The Honourable, time first. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, Government House Leader.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I suspect if you're at Canada's House, you'll find unanimous consent to call it 1:30 at this time so we could begin private members' hour.
Is it agreed to see the clock? Agreed. L'honorable député de Mégantic-Clairable.
The Honourable Member for Mégantic-Clairable. Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent that notwithstanding any special order or procedure of the House, the second reading of S-216 on the effectiveness and responsibility of registered charities standing in the name of the member for Northumberland, Peterborough South, be removed and withdrawn. Will all those opposed to what the Honourable Member is moving please say nay? Noted. The House has heard the terms of the motion. Will all those in opposition please say nay? Carried.
Accordingly, the order for second reading is discharged and the bill is dropped from the order paper. And it being 1:20, the House stands adjourned until next Monday at 11 a.m. pursuant to Standing Order 24-1.